Hey everyone, I'm Peter Stories here to guide you today. If you use this video to drift off to sleep, please tap like, hit subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. Now settle in, get cozy, and let yourself relax. The tent was inside out. David Ramirez had been a ranger at Glacier National Park for 11 years, and in that time he'd seen plenty of abandoned campsites. Gear scattered by bears, tents collapsed by wind, even the occasional site that looked like someone had left in a hurry. But he'd never seen a tent that had been turned completely inside out, seams facing the world, as if someone had peeled it like an orange and reassembled it wrong. He crouched beside it, his Motorola radio heavy on his hip, and touched the nylon with his fingertips. The fabric was frozen stiff despite the morning sun, covered in a thin layer of frost that shouldn't exist in August. The tent poles were still threaded through their channels, which meant whoever did this had somehow reversed the entire structure without removing the frame. Physically impossible, but there it was. Base. This is Ramirez. I'm at the Bowman Lake site. You need to see this. Static answered him for 3 seconds before dispatcher Linda Huang's voice crackled through. Copy that, Ramirez. What have you got? The missing hiker's tent. It's... He paused, trying to find words that wouldn't make him sound insane. It's been altered. I'm going to need forensics up here. Forensics? David, we're doing a search and rescue, not a crime scene investigation. I know what we're doing, Linda. I'm telling you something's wrong here. He stood and surveyed the rest of the campsite. Tyler Dawson, 26, from Seattle, had been reported missing 3 days ago when he failed to check in with his girlfriend. His vehicle was still at the trailhead. His permit indicated he was camping at Bowman Lake. And now David was staring at a campsite that looked like it had been decorated by something with no understanding of human geometry. The sleeping bag was laid out flat on the ground, unzipped and spread like a dissection specimen. The camp stove sat on a rock with all its components disassembled and arranged in a perfect circle. Tyler's backpack hung from a tree branch, but it was hanging upside down and the straps were tied in knots that David's fingers couldn't follow when he tried to trace their pattern. Everything was wrong, but nothing was damaged. It was as if someone had taken the entire campsite and reassembled it according to rules that didn't apply to three-dimensional space. David pulled out his GPS unit, a Garmin 60 CSX that had never failed him, and marked the coordinates. N 48 49 23, W 14 311. He photographed everything with his digital camera, the lens fogging in the strange cold that seemed to emanate from the campsite itself. His breath came out in visible clouds, even though the ambient temperature was 68 degrees. The forest around him was silent. That was the second wrong thing. No birds, no squirrels, no insects. Just the whisper of wind through the lodgepole pines and the distant sound of Bowman Lake lapping against its shore. In 11 years, David had never experienced complete silence in these woods. The ecosystem here was too vibrant, too alive. This silence felt like a held breath. He found the first footprint 20 yards from the tent, pressed into soft earth near the water. Bare feet, which was strange enough, but the print was wrong. The toes were too long, the arch too high, and there were only 4 toes instead of 5. David measured it with his tape measure, 14 inches long, 6 inches across at the ball. He'd done enough tracking to know that no human foot, no bear paw, no mountain lion print looked like this. He followed the tracks. They led away from the campsite in a straight line, never deviating, never adjusting for terrain. Where a fallen log blocked the path, the prints continued on the other side without any indication of the creature jumping or climbing over. The tracks went through the log, as if whatever made them didn't recognize obstacles as something to be avoided. After a quarter mile, the print simply stopped. The last impression was deep and clear, pressed into mud at the edge of a small stream, and then nothing. No tracks on the other side of the water, no disturbance in the stream bed, no indication of which direction the creature had gone. It had just ceased to exist at that exact spot. David stood at the edge of the stream and felt something he hadn't experienced since his first year as a ranger. Genuine unease, not fear. He'd trained himself out of fear, replaced it with systematic analysis and protocol. But unease was different. Unease was his rational mind acknowledging that the data didn't fit his models. He took soil samples. He photographed the tracks from multiple angles. He measured the distance between prints, 41 inches, far longer than a human stride. He documented everything because that's what you did when confronted with anomalies. You collected evidence, you analyzed it, and you found the rational explanation. There was always a rational explanation. His radio crackled. "Ramirez, what's your status?" "Still at the site." "Linda, I need you to pull any incident reports from this area over the past 5 years. Unusual animal activity, strange sightings, anything odd. You think there's a connection?" "I think Tyler Dawson didn't just get lost." "Rangers don't get to think, David. We get to find people. You need anything else up there?" "Send me the file on local legends, Native American stories, settler accounts, whatever we've got in the archive." "You're kidding." "Do I sound like I'm kidding?" A pause. "You sound like you need to come back and get some sleep. You've been out there since 0500. Just send me the files. I'll be back before dark." He clicked off the radio before she could argue. Linda meant well, but she hadn't seen the tent. She hadn't felt the cold that had no source or stood in a forest that had forgotten how to make sound. David continued his sweep of the area, moving in expanding circles from the campsite. He found Tyler's water filter hung in a tree, 15 feet up, balanced perfectly on a branch too thin to support a human's weight. He found a single hiking boot filled with pine needles and small stones, arranged by size like a child's collection. He found a Nalgene bottle that had been crushed flat and then inflated again, the plastic showing no stress marks, no indication that it had ever been deformed. At the base of a large Douglas fir, he found scratches in the bark, long, deep gouges that spiraled around the trunk, climbing higher than any bear could reach. The wood was freshly exposed, sap still bleeding from the wounds, but the scratches had an odd quality to them. They weren't random. They formed patterns, geometric shapes that repeated every 3 feet, symbols that looked almost like letters but belonged to no alphabet David recognized. He photographed them anyway. Everything went into the record. That was the discipline that had made him senior ranger, the methodical documentation that had solved a dozen missing person cases before this one. Every mystery had a solution. You just had to collect enough data. But the symbols bothered him. They bothered him more than the tent, more than the footprints, because they suggested intelligence. Random natural phenomena could be explained. Intelligence with unknown motives could not. The sun was starting its afternoon descent when David's GPS suddenly flickered and died. He smacked it twice, the universal percussive maintenance technique, but the screen stayed dark. The battery indicator had shown 80% charge 5 minutes ago. He pulled out his backup compass and frowned. The needle was spinning slowly, completing a full rotation every 10 seconds, never settling on magnetic north. His radio produced only static now. He'd lost contact with base an hour ago and assumed it was terrain interference, common enough in the mountains. But now, standing in a slight clearing with line of sight to the valley, he should have had perfect reception. Instead, all he heard was a sound underneath the static, faint but growing clearer, that sounded like someone chewing. David turned in a slow circle. The forest had changed while he wasn't paying attention. The trees seemed closer together than they'd been, their branches creating a canopy that blocked more light. The shadows fell in directions that didn't match the sun's position. The temperature had dropped another 10 degrees, and his breath now hung in the air like fog. Something was watching him. He couldn't see it, couldn't hear it, but his hindbrain, the part that evolved to detect predators, was screaming at him to run. He forced himself to stay still, to breathe steadily, to analyze the situation logically. Fact: his equipment was malfunctioning simultaneously. Fact: the environment was exhibiting anomalous properties. Fact: Tyler Dawson had disappeared from this location 3 days ago. Hypothesis: there was an explanation that connected these facts, and panic wouldn't help him find it. He started walking back toward the campsite, marking his trail with orange flagging tape every 100 feet. The forest resisted him. Not physically, but subtly. A root that caught his foot where no root had been before. A branch that scraped his face when he knew he'd left enough clearance. A depression in the ground that twisted his ankle. The woods didn't want him here anymore. It took him 40 minutes to hike what should have been a 15-minute walk. When he emerged at the campsite, the inside-out tent was exactly where he'd left it. But now there was something inside it. He could see the bulge of mass pressing against the reversed fabric. Something large curled into the small space. David approached slowly, hand on the bear spray attached to his belt. "Tyler, if that's you, I need you to come out slowly." The shape inside the tent shifted. A sound came from it. Not quite speech, not quite animal vocalization. It was wet and labored, like breathing through torn tissue. The tent fabric rippled as whatever was inside moved toward the opening. A hand emerged first. It was pale, almost translucent, with skin that looked like it had been submerged in water for days. The fingers were too long, the joints bending in too many places. It grabbed the tent's edge and pulled, and David saw the face. It had been Tyler Dawson. Maybe yesterday, maybe 3 days ago. But the man who dragged himself out of the inside-out tent was not someone who could be saved. His eyes were completely black, including the whites. His mouth hung open too wide, the jaw dislocated and hanging loose. His clothes were shredded, and underneath David could see ribs pressing against skin so thin it was almost transparent. "Help," Tyler said, but the voice didn't come from his mouth. It came from somewhere behind David, a perfect imitation of his own voice. "Help me, I'm so hungry." David stumbled backward, his training evaporating. This wasn't in any manual, any protocol. This was something else entirely. Tyler Thing stood up, impossibly tall, its spine cracking and popping as it straightened. It was at least 7 feet now, though it had been average height in its driver's license photo. The skin pulled tight across its frame, and David could see its heart beating behind translucent flesh, the muscle moving wrong, contracting in irregular rhythms. "I found it," Tyler said in David's voice. "I found what lives here. Do you want to see? Do you want to know?" David ran. He'd spent 11 years teaching hikers that you never run from predators, that running triggers chase instinct, that staying calm and backing away slowly was survival protocol. But protocol was written for bears and mountain lions, for rational animals operating on instinct and hunger. Protocol wasn't written for things that wore human skin like borrowed clothes and spoke in stolen voices. The forest had been waiting for him to run. He realized that immediately. The trail he'd marked with orange flags was gone. Or rather, the flags were there, but they led in the wrong direction, forming a path that spiraled deeper into the woods instead of back toward the trailhead. The shadows moved independently of any light source, pooling in his peripheral vision like living things. Behind him, Tyler Thing was following. Not running, not hurrying, just walking with that too long stride that covered ground faster than David's sprint. He could hear it breathing, a rattling sound like wind through hollow trees, and underneath that it was singing. A song in a language that predated English, predated all European languages, words that hurt to hear because they came from a time when humans were prey and winter lasted forever. David's rational mind, the part of him that had spent a decade studying ecology and wilderness management, tried to assert itself. This was impossible. Mass couldn't be created or destroyed. Bodies didn't transform like this. There were laws, physics, biology, thermodynamics. The universe had rules. But the universe in Glacier National Park was playing by different rules now. He vaulted over a fallen log and felt hands grab his ankle. Multiple hands emerging from underneath the log, pale and reaching. He kicked free and kept running, no longer caring about direction or navigation. His GPS was dead, his compass was useless, and the only thing that mattered was distance between himself and whatever Tyler had become. The trees were speaking now. He could hear words in their creaking branches, syllables formed by the friction of bark on bark. They were saying, "Weedico," over and over. A word he didn't know but understood in his bones meant something hungry, something that ate and was never full. He burst into a clearing and stopped. In the center stood a structure. Not quite a building, not quite a pile of bones. Human remains had been arranged in geometric patterns, femurs and ribs creating a framework that defied architecture. Skulls served as cornerstones, their empty sockets all facing the same direction. At the center hung Tyler's other hiking boot, suspended by nothing David could see, rotating slowly. This was the source. Whatever had happened to Tyler had started here. David's analytical mind seized on that fact even as his primal brain screamed at him to keep running. If there was a source, there were rules. If there were rules, there was a way to survive. He forced himself to look at the structure more carefully, to document what he saw. The bones were old, decades at minimum, possibly older. They'd been cleaned with precision, no tissue remaining, and arranged according to some pattern he couldn't quite grasp. It was like looking at a four-dimensional object flattened into 3 dimensions, angles that shouldn't connect somehow meeting. You understand now? Tyler's voice behind him, still using David's intonation, still too calm. This is older than the park, older than the rangers, older than the idea that humans could protect anything from what lives in the wild. David turned slowly. Tyler Thing stood at the clearing's edge, but it had changed again. Its skin was now covered in frost, ice crystals forming patterns across its chest and arms. Its breath came out as white vapor that hung in the air and formed shapes. Animals, humans, symbols he couldn't read. The blackness of its eyes had spread, crawling across its face like spilled ink. What are you? David's voice was steady. He was surprised by that. Hungry? Tyler smiled, and its teeth were all incisors now, pointed and numerous. So hungry. Have been hungry since the first winter when the food ran out and we ate each other and discovered that meat tasted better than starving. The elders called us wichtiko. The rangers call us missing persons, but we're just hunger with a shape to wear. The thing that had been Tyler Dawson took a step forward. The frost spread from where its feet touched the ground, grass withering and blackening. The temperature plummeted so fast that David's exposed skin burned with cold. His breath froze in his throat. You study the wilderness, Tyler Thing said. You catalog it, measure it, try to understand it. But you can't understand hunger. Hunger is older than understanding. Hunger is what's left when everything else burns away. David's hand found the bear spray on his belt. It was a ridiculous gesture, bear spray against something that violated thermodynamics. But his body needed to do something, needed to fight even when fighting was futile. He pulled the canister free and aimed it at Tyler's face. You really think that will help? Tyler laughed, and the sound was wrong, pitched too high and too low simultaneously. We wore your friend's skin for 3 days before you found us. We learned to be human again. We can learn to be you too. Would you like that? Would you like to be hungry forever? The thing lunged. David pressed the trigger. Capsaicin spray, 2 million Scoville units designed to stop grizzly bears, erupted from the canister. It hit Tyler Thing directly in the face, and the creature stopped, tilting its head in curiosity rather than pain. Then it opened its mouth wider than any human jaw could open, and the spray disappeared into that void. It swallowed the entire cloud of capsaicin like inhaling smoke, and when it closed its mouth, it smiled. Spicy, it said in David's voice. David ran again. Not away from the clearing this time. There was nowhere to run that the Wittiko wouldn't follow. Instead, he ran toward the bone structure, toward the center of whatever this was. If this was where it started, maybe this was where it could end. He reached the structure and grabbed Tyler's suspended hiking boot. The moment his fingers touched the leather, the world lurched. The clearing twisted, geometry folding in on itself, and suddenly he was seeing everything from a different angle. The bones weren't just arranged. They were holding something, constraining something that existed in a space perpendicular to normal reality. The Wittiko screamed, and the sound had physical weight. It knocked David to the ground, blood running from his ears. Through blurred vision, he saw Tyler Thing change again, the human features melting away to reveal what lay beneath. It was thin beyond skeletal, all angles and sharp edges, covered in matted white fur. Its face was an elongated skull with antlers growing from the temples, and its eyes, still black, held an intelligence that was ancient and alien and desperately, eternally hungry. "You can't break it," the Witico said, but now its voice was multiplied, dozens of voices speaking in unison. All the people it had consumed, all the rangers and hikers and visitors who disappeared in these mountains over the decades. "The cage needs feeding. We feed it. We bring it meat. That's the bargain that keeps us here, keeps us from spreading. You don't want us to spread." David pulled at the boot. The leather was frozen solid, fused to whatever invisible force held it suspended. The symbols on the trees around the clearing began to glow with pale light, the same symbols he'd seen carved into bark earlier. They were markers, warnings, boundaries. "The Blackfeet knew," the Witico said, circling him now, multiple voices creating harmony. "They marked this place as forbidden. They didn't hike here, didn't camp here, didn't come within sight of these trees. But you Europeans, you had to map everything, claim everything, make it safe for families and children. You broke the old agreements. So we adapted. We learned to eat the lost ones, the unprepared ones, the ones who wandered too far from the trail. We became part of the park's natural dangers. Another statistic in missing person reports. The creature was close enough now that David could smell it. Decay and ice and something underneath that was older than smell, a sense memory from when humans huddled in caves and prayed that winter would end. "Tyler saw us," the voices continued. "He photographed us. He wanted proof of cryptids for his blog, so we showed him. We showed him everything. He died knowing the truth, that the wilderness was never empty, never safe, never ours. Would you like to know the truth too, David Ramirez? Would you like to understand?" David's fingers found his multi-tool. The knife blade locked into place, and before the rational part of his brain could stop him, he stabbed it into the center of the bone structure. The blade hit something that wasn't bone, wasn't physical, but was somehow solid. Reality cracked around the impact point. The Witico shrieked. The voices separated, each person it had consumed screaming independently. The frost covering its body cracked and fell away, revealing flesh underneath that was too pale, too thin, barely containing the shape of something that didn't want to be bound by anatomy. "Wrong," it hissed. "Wrong, wrong. You don't know what you're doing. You'll let us out, you'll let us all out." David twisted the knife. The crack in reality widened. Through it, he could see something else. Not another place, but another state of being. A space where hunger lived in its pure form, where the concept of consumption existed without need for a body. The Witico wasn't a creature. It was an idea that had learned to wear flesh. "Please," Tyler's voice emerged from the chorus, clearer than the others. "Please, I'm still in here. I'm still hungry. I can't stop being hungry. Please make it stop." David pulled the knife free. The crack sealed immediately, reality snapping back into place with a sound like breaking ice. The Witico collapsed, its form becoming less solid, the boundaries of its body blurring. It clawed at the ground, leaving furrows in frozen earth, trying to drag itself back to full existence. "You don't understand," it whispered, voices fading. "We were keeping others away. We were the guardians. We were the price of your safety. Without us, the hungry winter finds new paths. Without us, the old cold spreads. You've doomed so many more than you've saved." David watched it dissolve, returning to the spaces between things. Tyler's face was the last part to fade, that expression of desperate hunger finally easing into something like relief. The clearing became just a clearing again, full of bones that were suddenly nothing but old remains. The structure collapsing into a pile of relics that would confuse archaeologists for years. The temperature rose. The silence broke. Birds sang again, insects buzzed, and the forest remembered how to be alive. David's radio suddenly crackled with Linda's voice. "Amarez, respond. David, we're sending a team. What's your status?" He looked down at his hands. They were shaking. The multi-tool was still clenched in his right fist, the blade covered in something that looked like frost but smelled like spoiled meat. His GPS flickered back to life, showing his exact coordinates. N 48 degree 4923, W 114 degree 0311. Exactly where he'd started. "Base," he said, voice hoarse. "I'm at Bowman Lake. Tyler Dawson is..." He paused. What could he say? That Tyler had been transformed into a Whitico? That he'd destroyed a binding structure that had contained something ancient and hungry? That he might have just made everything worse? "Tyler Dawson is deceased," he finished. "I've found remains. Send the recovery team." "Copy that. Are you safe?" Was he safe? The clearing was quiet now, peaceful even. The bone structure had crumbled. The strange cold was gone. Everything seemed normal except for the persistent feeling that he'd cut the wrong wire, opened the wrong door, broken something that couldn't be repaired. "Yeah," David said. "I'm safe." He started the long hike back to the trailhead, marking his path carefully with orange flags. The forest let him go this time, the trail cooperating, the shadows falling in appropriate directions. Everything was back to normal. Everything was fine, except for the footprints he found halfway back. Bare feet, too large, 4 toes instead of 5. Fresh prints, made within the last hour. They paralleled his trail for 100 yards and then diverged deeper into the wilderness, heading north toward areas where no trails existed, where the maps showed only blank space labeled unmaintained wilderness. David photographed them. He took measurements. He documented everything according to protocol. Then he kept walking, pretending not to notice when he saw another set of prints and another, all heading north like a migration, like the thing he'd destroyed wasn't a prison but a seal, and now the prisoners were free to wander. The recovery team met him at the trailhead just before sunset. They had questions about Tyler's remains, about the strange campsite, about why David looked like he'd aged a decade in a single day. He gave them facts, coordinates, observations, clinical descriptions. He didn't mention what he'd seen, what he'd fought, what he'd broken. That night in his ranger station cabin, David pulled up missing person reports for the entire national park system. He expanded the search to include all federal wilderness areas in Montana, Wyoming, Idaho. The numbers were higher than they should be, much higher. Hikers who vanished without trace, leaving behind campsites arranged in impossible ways, tents turned inside out, belongings organized according to alien geometry. He'd thought the Whitico at Bowman Lake was unique, a singular horror. But the pattern was clear once he knew what to look for. They were everywhere, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, scattered across the wilderness, bound to specific locations by structures like the one he'd destroyed. And if they all had the same warning, the same promise that they were guardians containing something worse. David opened his desk drawer and pulled out the multi-tool. The blade was clean now, but he could still see the crack it had made in reality, still feel the wrongness of that twisted space. He'd acted on instinct, training, the fundamental belief that humans could solve problems through intervention. He'd been wrong. The phone on his desk rang. Linda's voice, tight with concern. "David, we just got 3 more reports. Missing hikers in Yellowstone, Grand Teton, and Olympic National Park. All of them at remote campsites. All of them with unusual circumstances." He looked at the map on his wall, the pins marking disappearances across the western United States. The pins formed a pattern he hadn't seen before, a network, a web of places where the old boundaries held past tense, before he'd broken one. "Send me everything," he said. "David, you should rest. This isn't..." "Send me everything, Linda." He hung up and stared at the map. The Whitico's final words echoed in his memory. "Without us, the old cold spreads." Outside, the August night was unseasonably frigid. Frost formed on his window despite the summer heat. In the distance, something howled. Not a wolf, not a coyote, but something that had learned to imitate their sounds. Something that was learning to adapt, to spread, to explore territories that had been forbidden for centuries. David had spent 11 years believing that wilderness could be managed, that nature could be understood and controlled through scientific method and systematic observation. He'd been a good ranger precisely because he didn't believe in mysteries. only in problems waiting to be solved. Now he understood. The wilderness was never empty. The quiet places were quiet for reasons, and some problems couldn't be solved. They could only be contained, guarded, kept at bay by bargains made long before his ancestors set foot on this continent. He'd broken the bargain, and the hunger was spreading. The reports kept coming in through the night. More disappearances, more impossible campsites, more evidence that something ancient had been released, something that knew only consumption, only winter, only the endless need to feed. The Blackfeet had been right to avoid these places. The old stories were warnings, not superstitions. David marked each new incident on his map with a red pin. The pattern grew clearer with each addition, a spreading circle with Bowman Lake at its center. The contamination zone expanded at roughly 30 miles per day, following no roads, respecting no boundaries. By dawn, he'd accepted the truth. Tyler Dawson hadn't been the victim. David Ramirez had been. The Witico had wanted to be freed, had orchestrated everything to manipulate a rational man into breaking the structure. It had worn Tyler like bait, had presented itself as a monster to be defeated, knowing that rangers were trained to solve problems, to help people, to eliminate dangers. And he'd done exactly what it wanted. His radio crackled with early morning reports. Overnight temperature drops across 3 states. Frost in areas where frost shouldn't exist in August. Hikers reporting sounds in the forest that made them abandon their gear and flee to trailheads. The Witico weren't hiding anymore. They didn't need to. David pulled on his uniform and strapped on his equipment. His GPS, his radio, his bear spray that was useless against hunger given form. He checked the multi-tool one last time, that innocent blade that had cracked open a prison door. Then he headed out into the gray pre-dawn, back toward Bowman Lake, back toward the clearing where the old bones lay scattered. If he'd broken it, maybe he could rebuild it. Maybe he could find a way to restore the boundaries, renew the ancient agreements, contain what he'd released. It wasn't rational, wasn't scientific, wasn't anything his training had prepared him for, but the wilderness operated on older rules than science. Rules written in bone and hunger, and the desperate bargains of prey species trying to survive winter. Rules that predated understanding, predated civilization, predated the comfortable illusion that humans were anything more than meat. David Ramirez, senior ranger at Glacier National Park, rational man and systematic thinker, walked into the morning cold knowing he was probably going to die. But before he did, he needed to understand the full extent of what he'd done. He needed data. He needed evidence. He needed to document the end of the world so that someone someday might learn from his mistake. The forest welcomed him back with silence. Behind him, frost crept across the ranger station windows, spreading like searching fingers, hungry for warmth. Inside, the phones rang and rang with reports of the cold spreading, the disappearances multiplying, the wilderness reclaiming what had always been its own. The pins on the map fell, one by one, as the red zone expanded. And in the deep woods, where no trails existed and no maps marked the territory, things that had been bound were learning to walk again, learning to hunt again, learning to spread the eternal winter that had once covered the world before fire and civilization pushed it back into the forgotten places. Some doors once opened cannot be closed. Some hungers once freed cannot be satisfied. And some rangers, for all their training and rational minds, learned too late that the most dangerous thing in the wilderness is not the predator you can see. It's the one wearing human skin, speaking human words, and thanking you for setting it free. Hope you felt genuine terror. If you appreciate authentic horror rooted in real folklore, consider following for more stories. Which moment scared you most? Share your theory about what happened. The scratch marks went the wrong direction, up the tree instead of down, carved deep into bark 40 feet above the ground where nothing should climb. David Ramirez crouched at the base of the Douglas fir, his Garmin GPS registering the coordinates as 48.71 by 6 degree N, 121.2975 degree W, exactly 3.2 miles northeast of Thunder Creek Trailhead. He'd been a ranger at North Cascades National Park for 11 years, long enough to recognize the weight of wrongness pressing against his ribs as he studied the gouges. Each furrow ran 18 inches long, parallel to its neighbors, 4 distinct channels that had stripped away bark and scored the cambium beneath. The pattern suggested claws, except the deepest point was at the top of each mark, as though something had gripped the tree from above and scraped downward while climbing skyward. His breath formed small clouds in the October morning air. Temperature held at 38 degrees, unseasonably cold for the first week of the month. The forecast had predicted an early winter, and the Olympics to the west had already received their first significant snowfall. Here in the North Cascades, elevation 7,200 feet, the aspens had lost their leaves 2 weeks ahead of schedule, and the few remaining needles on the pines carried a brittle quality that spoke of coming frost. David stood, feeling the protest in his left knee, old injury from a climbing accident in 2004, and walked a slow circle around the tree. The bark wounds continued on the opposite side, same pattern, same impossible upward trajectory. He pulled out his digital camera, a Nikon D40 he'd bought specifically for documenting unusual findings, and photographed the marks from multiple angles. The timestamp would read 09:47 a.m., October 6, 2009. Brandon Mitchell had been reported missing 36 hours ago. 26 years old, experienced backpacker from Portland, solo hiking the Thunder Creek Trail system with plans to summit Tricuni Peak before the season ended. His vehicle, a 2005 Subaru Outback, had been found in the trailhead parking area with his permit properly displayed. Everything about the disappearance followed standard protocols except for one detail. Brandon's emergency contact, his sister Maya, had received a text message at 2:17 a.m. on October 5th that simply read, "Something wrong with the trees." The message troubled David more than he wanted to admit. In 11 years of search and rescue operations, he'd recovered hikers who'd fallen, gotten lost, suffered hypothermia, broken bones, encountered aggressive wildlife. He'd retrieved 3 bodies. But he'd never had anyone describe the environment itself as threatening. Trees were constant, neutral, predictable. They didn't do things wrong. Yet here he stood, looking at evidence that contradicted the fundamental laws of animal behavior and physics. His Motorola radio crackled. "Ramirez, you copy?" He unclipped the radio from his belt. "Go ahead, dispatch." Weather update. Front moving in faster than predicted. Forest Service is calling for possible snow at elevation by 1800 hours. They want all SAR personnel back at base camp by 1600. David checked his watch. 6 hours. Acknowledged. I'm at waypoint 7, moving to waypoint 8, then I'll loop back. Copy that. Any signs? He looked up at the claw marks stretching toward the canopy. Negative. Nothing yet. The lie felt heavy in his mouth, but he couldn't explain what he'd found over the radio. It required context, analysis, a conversation that addressed the impossibility of what he was seeing. He'd document it, photograph it, and present it to the team when he returned. They'd have explanations. Bear marking territory by reaching as high as possible, except bears didn't climb that high on this species of tree. Mountain goat, except there were no hoof prints, and goats didn't have claws. Equipment damage from a previous climbing party, except the wounds were fresh, sap still tacky, no weathering. David continued northeast, following the planned search grid. The terrain grew rougher, loose scree giving way to granite outcroppings that required careful footing. He'd hiked this region dozens of times, knew the trails and unmarked routes, could navigate by landmarks even without GPS. The familiarity should have been comforting. Instead, every familiar detail felt slightly askew, like a photograph taken from an unusual angle. Waypoint 8 brought him to a small clearing where Thunder Creek formed a natural pool before continuing its descent. The water ran clear and cold, snow melt from higher elevations feeding the current. David knelt to refill his water bottle, adding a purification tablet from habit rather than necessity. The streams here were clean enough to drink directly. As he waited for the tablet to dissolve, he noticed something wedged between 2 rocks at the water's edge. A boot. Salomon X Ultra, men's size 10, still laced. The same brand and model listed in Brandon Mitchell's gear inventory. David's pulse kicked up. He pulled on latex gloves from his pack and carefully extracted the boot. Heavy, still contained a foot. The severance was clean, too clean, the flesh around the ankle exhibiting none of the tearing or crushing typical of predator attacks or traumatic amputation. It looked surgical, precise, as though something had simply decided the foot should no longer be attached and made it so. No blood in the boot, no blood on the surrounding rocks. The flesh had a waxy, pale quality, and the temperature felt wrong against his gloved hands. Colder than the ambient air, colder than the stream, as though whatever heat had existed in the tissue had been drawn out by something other than environmental exposure. David set the boot down carefully, his analytical mind cataloging details while a more primal part of his brain screamed warnings he couldn't quite articulate. He photographed the boot from 6 angles, noted its exact position relative to the stream, recorded the GPS coordinates, then placed it inside an evidence bag from his pack. The protocol for human remains was clear: secure the evidence, mark the location, radio for immediate backup, establish a perimeter. David reached for his radio, then stopped. Something was watching him. The sensation arrived without sound or movement, a pressure against his awareness that made his scalp tighten. He turned slowly, scanning the tree line. Nothing. Dense forest, shadows between the trunks, the understory thick with ferns and deadfall. Everything looked exactly as it should, except the birds had stopped singing. David had grown up in rural Montana, had spent his childhood in forests, had developed the unconscious awareness of natural soundscapes that all experienced outdoorsmen possessed. The absence of bird calls meant predator nearby: cougar, bear, something that made smaller creatures go silent and still. He'd experienced it before, knew how to respond. Stay calm, make noise, appear large, back away slowly. But this silence felt different, deeper, as though the birds hadn't simply stopped singing but had fled entirely, or died, or never existed at all. His hand moved to the bear spray on his hip, an action born of training rather than conscious thought. The canister felt inadequate, a child's toy against the weight of attention pressing down on him from the forest. David activated his radio. His voice came out steady, professional. "Dispatch, this is Ramirez. I've found evidence at waypoint 8, human remains. Possible 1054. Code for deceased subject. Copy, Ramirez. Can you confirm?" "Confirmed. Requesting immediate backup and medical examiner notification." "Static then." "Acknowledged. Nearest team is at waypoint 3. I'd have 45 minutes. Hold position and secure the scene." 45 minutes. David scanned the tree line again, saw nothing, felt everything. The watching sensation hadn't diminished. If anything, it had intensified, focused, as though his radio transmission had drawn attention rather than help. He moved away from the stream to higher ground, positioning himself where he could observe the approaches while keeping the evidence bag in sight. Standard procedure. Textbook response. Everything by the book. The temperature was dropping. David checked his thermometer. 34 degrees, 4-degree drop in 15 minutes. Weather front moving in ahead of schedule, or something else. He pulled his jacket tighter and waited. The forest remained silent. At minute 37, David noticed the trees. Not the trees themselves, but their arrangement. From his elevated position, he could see the pattern they formed. A rough circle, perhaps 60 feet in diameter, with the stream and the evidence bag at its center. The pattern wouldn't be visible from ground level, required the exact vantage point where he now stood to perceive. And the pattern was too regular, too deliberately spaced, to be natural. David pulled out his camera and photographed the formation. Through the viewfinder, the pattern became even more apparent. Trees forming concentric circles, each ring slightly offset from the next, creating a spiral that drew the eye inward toward the stream. He'd studied enough forestry to know that trees didn't grow in geometric patterns. Wind dispersal, animal caching, fire succession, all created organic, irregular distributions. This was different. Intentional. He lowered the camera. The trees looked normal again. Random, their spiral arrangement visible only through the lens or from this specific position. David's analytical mind began assembling theories. Selective logging in the past that created this pattern. Unusual soil composition affecting growth. Volcanic activity shaping underground root systems. Each explanation dissolved under scrutiny. The trees were mixed age, different species, showed no signs of human intervention. No historical records of logging or significant geological events in this specific area. The radio crackled. Ramirez, ETA 15 minutes. What's your 20? He provided coordinates, confirmed he was secure, requested they approach from the south. Standard protocols, standard language. Nothing in the transmission conveyed the fact that reality had begun tilting sideways. David waited, and the forest watched back. When the backup team arrived, 3 rangers led by Sarah Valdez, the senior SAR coordinator, David walked them through his findings with professional detachment. The boot, the photographs, the clean severance, the absence of blood. Sarah's expression shifted from concern to grim focus as she examined the evidence. "Jesus," she said quietly, "this is wrong." "Predator?" asked Tim Chen, the youngest ranger on the team. "No predator does this," Sarah said. She looked at David. "You secure the perimeter. 60-foot radius, no other evidence visible. The trail continues northeast, but I waited for backup before proceeding." Sarah nodded, then keyed her radio. "Dispatch, we need the medical examiner and a full forensics team, and contact the tribal council. This is their land originally, and given the unusual nature of the evidence, we should have their input." David felt something cold settle in his chest. Sarah was Lummi, had worked with tribal authorities on multiple cases, understood the protocols around culturally sensitive discoveries. But her voice carried a tremor he'd never heard before, an undercurrent of fear that no amount of professional training could fully mask. "You recognize something," David said. Not a question. Sarah looked at the trees, at the spiral pattern visible only from their elevated position. "Maybe. Old stories. Things my grandmother told me." She shook her head. "We'll discuss it later. Right now, we need to expand the search grid and find the rest of Brandon Mitchell." They worked through the afternoon, establishing a systematic search pattern that radiated outward from the stream. David paired with Sarah, moving northeast while Tim and the others covered adjacent sectors. The temperature continued dropping, now hovering at 29 degrees, and the first snowflakes began drifting through the canopy around 15:30. At 16:15, David found the second item, a backpack Arc'teryx brand hanging from a branch 15 feet above the ground. Not snagged or caught, but deliberately placed, the straps tied around the branch in a neat bow. The pack matched Brandon Mitchell's gear description. David photographed it from below, documented the height and position, then called for Sarah. She arrived within 3 minutes, looked up at the pack, and her jaw tightened. "It's a cache," she said. "Old practice. You put food up high to keep it away from bears. 15 feet isn't high enough. Bears can climb 20, 25 feet easily." "I know." Sarah pulled out her own camera, took several photos. "But it's not about actually protecting the food. It's about respecting the spirits. You make the gesture, show you're willing to share, and they leave you alone." She lowered the camera. "Usually." David felt the questions building but forced them down. "How do we retrieve it?" "Climbing gear. Tim's the best technical climber. We'll have him go up." 20 minutes later, Tim had secured a rope and ascended to the branch. He untied the pack carefully, noting aloud that the knots were complex, precise, not the hasty work of someone in distress. He lowered the pack to Sarah, who placed it on a tarp and opened it with gloved hands. Everything was there. Tent, sleeping bag, camp stove, food supplies carefully organized in bear-proof containers. Clothes folded neatly, first aid kit unopened. Water filter, rope, climbing hardware. Everything Brandon Mitchell would need for a week in the wilderness, except Brandon Mitchell himself. And one more thing. Every item had been cleaned. Not just wiped down, but meticulously, obsessively cleaned. The camp stove showed no carbon scoring. The tent had no dirt. The sleeping bag smelled of detergent, even the boots. And there was a second pair of boots, waterproof Vasks, also size 10, were pristine, laces white, soles showing no wear despite the 3 days Brandon had been hiking. Sarah picked up the water filter, turned it over. This was used. The cartridge shows flow marks, but it's been cleaned internally. That takes effort. Time. Why would someone... She stopped, set it down. This isn't making sense. No, David agreed. It's not. Tim called down from above. Hey, there's something else up here. What? Marks on the tree, like the ones you described earlier, David. Going up. David's stomach tightened. How high? All the way to the top. Maybe 50, 60 feet. They're fresh. The snow was falling harder now, accumulating on the ground, covering their tracks. Sarah made the decision quickly. Pull back to base camp. Reassess with full daylight and better weather. They couldn't conduct an effective search in deteriorating conditions, and the evidence they'd collected needed proper analysis. As they hiked back toward the trailhead, David found himself thinking about Sarah's grandmother's stories, about the words she hadn't spoken but that hung in the air between them. He'd grown up hearing the same stories, dismissed them as mythology, folklore, cautionary tales to keep children from wandering too far from home. Wendigo. The word tasted like copper in his mind. His grandfather, who'd been Blackfeet, had told him about the Wendigo when David was 8, a spirit of winter and famine born from cannibalism and endless hunger. It transformed men into monsters, twisted their bodies into something that couldn't be satisfied no matter how much it consumed. The stories varied by tribe. Algonquin, Ojibwe, Cree, each had their own version, but the core remained consistent. Violation of taboo, transformation, insatiable appetite. But those were stories. Explanations for winter starvation, warnings against the psychological horror of survival cannibalism, cultural teachings wrapped in supernatural metaphor. They weren't real. David looked back over his shoulder at the forest. In the gathering dusk, the trees seemed taller, the spaces between them deeper. And somewhere in that darkness, something that had taken Brandon Mitchell apart with surgical precision was watching them leave. Base camp had been established at the Thunder Creek Trailhead parking area, a cluster of vehicles and emergency tents that looked incongruously modern against the wilderness backdrop. The medical examiner, Dr. Robert Fitzgerald, had driven up from Bellingham and was examining the boot under portable floodlights when David's team arrived. Incredible, Fitzgerald murmured, more to himself than anyone else. He was in his 60s, had performed hundreds of wilderness death investigations, had seen every variation of how the human body could be destroyed by nature. The severance is almost perfectly transverse. No sawing motion, no tearing. Just separated, like it was frozen in liquid nitrogen and snapped off. Could that happen naturally? Sarah asked. Extreme cold? Not in one night. This kind of tissue damage would require sustained exposure to temperatures well below freezing, probably -20 or colder for hours. And even then you'd see ice crystal formation, cellular rupture. This is clean. Too clean. David stood at the edge of the light, watching Fitzgerald work. The boot sat on a stainless steel examination tray, the severed foot pale and waxy. And despite his 11 years of experience, David felt his dinner threatening to come back up. It wasn't the gore. There wasn't any. It was the precision, the wrongness, the sense that he was looking at something that violated natural law. His phone buzzed. Text message from the dispatch office. Tribal Council sending a representative. ETA 0900 tomorrow. His name is Joseph Whitefish. Please extend full cooperation. David pocketed his phone and walked to where Sarah stood near the command tent, hands wrapped around a cup of coffee. Your grandmother's stories, he said quietly. Tell me. Sarah glanced at him, then at the forest, at the darkness that pressed against their ring of artificial light. You won't believe them. Try me. She took a long drink of coffee. When I was young, maybe 7 or 8, My grandmother took me to the reservation for a naming ceremony. Lummi tradition, important. But the day we arrived, the elders told us the ceremony was postponed. A hunter had gone missing in the mountains, and they'd found his camp destroyed. Not by a bear, not by anything natural. They said the Wendigo had marked him. Wendigo, David repeated, giving the word weight. You know the stories? Some. My grandfather talked about them. I always thought they were metaphorical. Sarah's laugh was bitter. So did I. But my grandmother explained it differently. She said the Wendigo wasn't a monster, not in the way we think. It was a consequence. What happens when someone breaks the most fundamental law? You don't consume your own kind. When you do, when you choose your own survival over that basic prohibition, something breaks inside you. Your humanity peels away. And what's left is hunger that can never be filled, need that just grows and grows until there's nothing left but appetite. That's still metaphor, a warning against cannibalism. Maybe, Sarah stared into her coffee. But my grandmother said the old ones knew how to recognize the signs, trees growing in circles, animals fleeing, cold that came too early and struck too deep, scratch marks going up instead of down because the thing didn't climb. It just existed higher and higher, always reaching upward, never satisfied with what it could touch. She looked at David. They found that hunter 3 weeks later. Pieces of him, scattered across 10 miles of forest. But here's the thing, they also found tracks. Humanoid, but wrong. Too long, too narrow. And they only appeared in snow, like whatever made them didn't actually touch the ground. David wanted to dismiss it, to pull out his rational explanations, his scientific training. But he kept seeing the boot, the clean severance, the cache of cleaned equipment hanging in a tree. The tribal representative tomorrow, Joseph Whitefish. What does the tribal council think is happening? They think we woke something up. Sarah finished her coffee. Last month, some climbers tried to summit Tricuni Peak. They got caught in a storm, had to emergency shelter for 3 days. When the weather cleared, they said they'd burned everything to stay warm. Everything. Including something they found in a cave. Old bundles wrapped in animal hide, artifacts, ceremonial objects. They posted about it on social media, treated it like a joke. She crushed the disposable cup. The tribal council sent people to investigate, but by then the climbers were gone. Whatever was in that cave, whatever those bundles were protecting or containing, they destroyed it. And now Brandon Mitchell is missing, and we're finding his body parts scattered through a forest that's behaving like it remembers something we've forgotten. David didn't sleep that night. He lay in his tent, listening to the wind move through the trees, and tried to reconcile what his training told him with what his instincts knew. The evidence pointed to an unknown predator, possibly a mentally disturbed individual, using the wilderness to stage elaborate murders. Serial killers had done similar things. The Zodiac, the Green River Killer, dozens of others. Find the pattern, find the perpetrator, apply logic and forensics and systematic investigation. But the scratch marks climbing upward, the boot with its precise amputation, the equipment cleaned with obsessive thoroughness and cached in a tree like an offering, the spiral pattern of trees visible only from a specific vantage point, none of it fit. At 03:30, David heard something outside his tent. Footsteps, but irregular, the gate wrong. He grabbed his flashlight and unzipped the tent flap, shining the beam into darkness. Nothing, but in the snow, fresh snow, accumulation of perhaps 4 inches since nightfall, there were marks, not footprints. Long, narrow depressions, like something had dragged itself across the ground without actually stepping. The marks led away from his tent, toward the forest, and disappeared at the tree line. David photographed them with his Nikon. The camera flashed stark against the snow. In the viewfinder, the depressions looked almost intentional, deliberate, as though whatever made them wanted to leave a message. I can reach your camp. I can reach your tent. I can reach you. He spent the rest of the night sitting at the edge of the light, watching the trees, and the trees watched back. Joseph Whitefish arrived at 09:15, driving a battered Ford pickup that looked older than David. He was perhaps 70, weathered face and white braided hair, wearing a thick wool coat and carrying a leather bag that smelled of sage and tobacco. Sarah greeted him in Lummi, a brief exchange that David couldn't follow, then introduced him to the team. Joseph listened to the briefing without interruption. Sarah showed him the photographs, the evidence, the maps marking where they'd found the boot and the backpack. When she finished, Joseph was quiet for a long moment. "Show me the trees," he finally said. David led him to waypoint 7, where the first scratch marks had been documented. Joseph studied them in silence, then pulled out a leather-bound notebook and sketched the pattern, adding annotations in a language David didn't recognize. When he finished, he placed his palm against the scarred bark and closed his eyes. "It's been marked," Joseph said. "This is a boundary marker, a warning." "Warning of what?" Sarah asked. "That something has been freed, or invited, or awakened." Joseph moved to the next tree, examined similar marks. The old ones used to maintain certain territories, sacred places, forbidden places, areas where the barrier between this world and the other was thin. They would perform ceremonies, leave offerings, maintain the balance. When those practices stopped, when the knowledge was lost or deliberately destroyed, the barriers weakened. David felt his skepticism warring with the evidence of his own eyes. "You're talking about spiritual entities, supernatural forces." Joseph looked at him. "I'm talking about things that exist whether you believe in them or not. Your science has a name for things that only become real when observed. Quantum mechanics, yes? In my tradition, we understand that observation works both ways. When you see something, you acknowledge it. You give it permission to be seen. And once something is seen, once it's acknowledged, it becomes real in a way it wasn't before." He knelt beside the tree, scooped up a handful of soil, let it sift through his fingers. Brandon Mitchell saw something, that text message to his sister, something wrong with the trees. He observed what should have remained unobserved, and by seeing it, by acknowledging it, he gave it form, gave it hunger. "So what do we do?" Sarah's voice was steady, but David heard the undercurrent of fear. "You don't hunt this," Joseph said. "You can't. It's not an animal. It's not even really a thing. It's more like a process, a transformation. Once it begins, it has to complete." He stood, brushed dirt from his hands. "But you can contain it, redirect it, give it what it wants so it doesn't take what it needs." David's analytical mind rebelled. "That's not a strategy, that's superstition." "Is it?" Joseph pulled a small leather pouch from his bag, opened it to reveal white powder. "This is ground bone mixed with salt and ash. In my tradition, it creates a boundary that certain things cannot cross. Would you like me to prove it?" Before David could respond, Joseph drew a circle in the snow, perhaps 6 feet in diameter, sprinkling the powder as he walked. When he completed the circle, the temperature inside it dropped dramatically. David watched his breath form thick clouds, saw frost spreading across the ground within the boundary, while the area outside remained comparatively warm. "Physics can explain that," David said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Sublimation, endothermic reaction, something." "Of course physics can explain it," Joseph agreed. "Because physics and spirituality aren't opposites. They're different languages describing the same reality. Your instruments measure the effects. My traditions understand the causes." He scattered the circle, and the temperature equalized. "Brandon Mitchell is dead. His body is scattered through these woods, and each piece has become part of the transformation. You'll find more. Feet, hands, maybe his head. All separated with precision, all cleaned, all cached like offerings. The thing that did it is still hungry, still transforming, and it will continue until it finishes the process or until someone stops it." "How do we stop it?" Sarah asked. Joseph looked toward the north, toward the higher elevations where the snow fell thick and constant. "You give it what it wants. Acknowledgement, confrontation. You go to where it lives now, where it's making its territory, and you face it. Not to fight it, but to witness it, to complete the cycle of observation." It saw Brandon Mitchell. He saw it. But the exchange wasn't complete. wasn't reciprocal. Someone needs to close the loop. David felt cold that had nothing to do with temperature. You're describing a death sentence. I'm describing a choice, Joseph corrected. Go to the source, face what's there, and either prove it's nothing, vindicate your rational worldview, or acknowledge it's real and learn how to coexist with it. He pulled out a larger pouch. I can give you protections. Things my tradition has used for centuries. They might work, they might not. But doing nothing means more deaths, more disappearances, more transformations. The team debated through the morning. Half wanted to call in federal resources, treat this as a murder investigation, apply systematic law enforcement protocols. The other half, Sarah, David, and a few others who'd grown up hearing the stories, understood that conventional approaches would fail against something that operated outside conventional rules. At 13th hour, David made his decision. I'll go, he said. Waypoint 9 is the highest point in the search grid. Elevation 8,300 feet. If something's establishing territory, that's where it would be. I'll take GPS, radio, full winter gear. If I'm not back in 6 hours, send a recovery team. Sarah shook her head. You're not going alone. Yes, I am. Because if this is what Joseph says it is, then it's about observation, acknowledgement, individual witness. A team doesn't work. It has to be one person making the choice to see. He looked at Joseph. Your protections, I'll take them, not because I believe, but because I'm willing to be wrong. Joseph nodded slowly. That's wisdom. He spent the next hour preparing David, marking his forehead with white ash, tying a small leather bundle to his pack, teaching him words in a language David didn't speak but somehow understood. Instructions, protocols, ways to address something that might be listening. At 14:30, David began the ascent. The trail was treacherous, snow-covered switchbacks that required focus to navigate. David climbed steadily, methodically, letting his body fall into the rhythm while his mind remained alert. He passed waypoint 8 at 15:45, where they'd found the boot. Something had disturbed the snow since yesterday. Long, narrow marks like the ones outside his tent leading uphill. He followed them. At 17:00, as dusk began settling, David reached a clearing at approximately 8,000 feet. The snow here was deeper, pristine, and in the center of the clearing stood a structure that shouldn't exist. A cairn, perhaps 12 feet tall, built from stones that showed no weathering. Fresh construction, impossible fresh given the snowfall. And arranged around the cairn in a careful spiral were objects. Clothing, equipment, personal items. David recognized Brandon Mitchell's jacket, his GPS unit, his climbing harness. Other items from other people. A child's stuffed animal, a woman's hiking boot, a man's wedding ring. Dozens of objects, all cleaned meticulously, all arranged with geometric precision. And on top of the cairn, propped against the highest stone, was a skull. Human, picked clean, positioned to face downslope toward David's approach. David's breath came short. His training screamed at him to retreat, to radio for backup, to treat this as a crime scene. But something deeper kept him moving forward, drawn by a compulsion that felt both alien and inevitable. He stopped 10 feet from the cairn. The forest had gone absolutely silent. No wind, no bird calls, no distant sounds of wildlife. Just his breathing and the soft crunch of snow under his boots. I see you, David said. His voice sounded small, swallowed by the silence. I acknowledge what you are. The temperature plummeted. David watched his breath freeze instantly, ice crystals forming in the air. And then, at the edge of the clearing, movement. Something stood between two trees. Tall, impossibly tall, perhaps 9 or 10 feet, and so thin it barely seemed to have width. At first, David thought it was a trick of shadows, his eyes creating patterns from darkness and branches. But as it moved forward, he saw the truth. It had been human once. The shape was there, limbs, torso, head, but stretched, attenuated, pulled to breaking point and beyond. The skin was white as the snow, pulled tight over bones that seemed too long, too numerous. The hands reached nearly to the ground, fingers extending into claws that were the exact size and shape of the marks on the trees. And the face. David's mind tried to reject what he saw, tried to label it hallucination, hypothermia-induced delusion, anything other than reality. But his eyes kept sending the same message. The thing standing before him wore Brandon Mitchell's face, recognizable but transformed, stretched vertically like putty pulled between two hands. The mouth had expanded, the jaw distending in a way that exposed not just teeth but something deeper, hungrier, an absence that wanted to be filled. It spoke, not with words, but with a sound that David felt in his bones, a vibration that translated directly into understanding. You see. Finally. You see. Now I can be. David's hand moved to the leather pouch Joseph had given him. He pulled it out, held it before him like a talisman. The thing that had been Brandon Mitchell watched the gesture and made a sound like laughter, if laughter could express infinite sadness. Your protections. Yes, the old ways. But I am not what those protect against. I am newer. Born from what you all forgot. You stopped feeding the spirits, stopped maintaining the boundaries, stopped believing that hunger could be anything other than metaphor. The thing took a step closer. David saw now that it didn't actually touch the ground, that its impossible height existed partially above the snow, as though it occupied space that normal matter couldn't fill. He tried to survive. Your Brandon Mitchell. When the storm came, when he found the cave with its old protections, he burned them for warmth. He was so cold, so hungry. He thought the bundles were just ceremonial decorations, meaningless superstition. But they were cages, bindings. And when he destroyed them, he let me out, let me in. And I was so very, very hungry. David found his voice. You killed him. I transformed him. There's a difference. He's not gone. He's become. He's here, in this form, in this hunger that grows and grows and never stops. And he wants you to understand. It wasn't murder. It was inevitability. The logical conclusion of forgetting that some hungers should never be fed. Why the cairn? The offerings? Because I remember being human. Because part of Brandon Mitchell still exists in here, screaming, trying to follow the protocols he didn't believe in until it was too late. He builds the cairn, arranges the offerings, tries to appease spirits that might forgive what he's become. But there is no forgiveness. There's only transformation, and more transformation until everything becomes hunger. The thing bent down, its spine flexing in ways that defied anatomy, until its distorted face was level with David's. The eyes were still Mitchell's eyes, brown and human, filled with an agony that had no bottom. You came to observe, to witness. Good. Now you can choose. Stay and join the transformation. Feed the hunger that never stops. Or run and carry the knowledge that some things should remain unobserved. Some taboos exist for reasons your science hasn't cataloged. Some hungers grow stronger, the more they're acknowledged. David stood frozen, understanding that this moment, this terrible, impossible moment, was the hinge upon which multiple futures turned. If he fled, the thing might follow, might expand its territory, might transform others. If he stayed, tried to fight or contain it, he'd likely become another offering on the cairn. Or there was Joseph's teaching. Complete the cycle. Full observation, full acknowledgement, without either feeding it or denying it. I see you, David repeated, voice steadier now. I acknowledge what you are. I witness the transformation and the tragedy. I understand that you're real, and I understand that I cannot, should not, do anything to stop you. Because stopping you would mean believing I have that power, and belief is what feeds you. The thing that had been Brandon Mitchell tilted its head. The gesture was almost curious. Wise. The old man taught you well, but knowledge has a price. Before David could react, the thing reached out with one impossibly long hand and touched his forehead, directly over the ash mark Joseph had placed. The contact lasted less than a second, But in that moment, David saw everything. He saw Brandon Mitchell's last days, the storm, the cold, the desperate decision to burn the bundles, the moment of transformation, when hunger became not just physical need, but existential absence, a void that expanded to fill every thought, every sensation. He saw other transformations, other times, other Wendigos born from taboo violation and forgotten wisdom. He saw the thin places where reality admitted its own uncertainty, where the carefully maintained boundaries between natural and supernatural dissolved under the pressure of disbelief. And he saw the future. More climbers, more hikers, more people who would stumble into these places without understanding what they touched, what they woke, what they became. When the thing withdrew its hand, David collapsed to his knees in the snow. His nose was bleeding, his vision blurred, and his entire body felt like it had been turned inside out and put back incorrectly. You understand now. You see clearly. That clarity will haunt you. Every tree will remind you of what grows in shadows. Every silence will echo with hunger. Every winter will bring the question, am I cold, or am I transforming? The thing stepped back, its form already becoming indistinct, blending with the twilight and the falling snow. Tell them what you saw, or don't. It won't matter. The barriers are weakening, the old protections are failing, and hunger is patient. We'll meet again, David Ramirez. Next winter, or the winter after. When you're deep in the forest and the cold comes too early and lasts too long. When you hear your name in a voice you don't recognize. When you find yourself thinking that maybe, just maybe, some rules are meant to be broken, then it was gone. Vanished into the forest with no sound, no tracks, no evidence it had ever existed except for the cairn and the skull and the profound wrongness that would never fully leave David's bones. He radioed down at 1930, voice hoarse, and told them he'd found nothing. No evidence, no signs, no leads. The search would continue tomorrow, weather permitting, but he needed to descend before full dark. Sarah met him at base camp, took one look at his face and didn't ask questions, just handed him coffee and sat beside him in silence. Joseph Whitefish approached an hour later. You saw it. Yes. All of it? Yes. And now you carry that knowledge. David stared into the fire someone had built. He's still in there. Mitchell. Part of him aware, trapped, experiencing the hunger but unable to stop it. That's the real horror. Not the transformation itself, but that consciousness persists. He knows what he's become, and he can't die. Joseph nodded slowly. That's the curse, the punishment. You violate the taboo, you become the lesson forever. How do we stop it? You don't. You respect it. You maintain the boundaries, honor the protections, teach the next generation why some rules exist. And you never ever forget that hunger is real, and it's always waiting. The search for Brandon Mitchell continued for 3 more days. They found 2 more pieces, a hand, partially frozen, wedged into a tree hollow, a section of rib cage stripped clean, arranged on a flat rock like a sculpture. Each discovery confirmed the pattern, precision, cleanliness, impossible positioning. On the 4th day, the tribal council closed the area. Sacred site, they declared, and the National Park Service didn't argue. Too many unexplained elements, too many questions that couldn't be answered through conventional investigation. Brandon Mitchell's case would remain open, officially unsolved. Another disappearance in wilderness that held secrets older than the science meant to explain them. David returned to duty 2 weeks later. He still worked as a ranger, still led search and rescue operations, still hiked the trails with professional competence. But something had changed. He moved differently through the forest now, with awareness that went beyond training. He noticed things he'd previously overlooked, the way trees sometimes formed patterns that weren't quite natural, the quality of silence that meant something predatory nearby, the particular cold that arrived too quickly and struck too deep. And sometimes, late at night, he'd wake in his cabin and hear sounds outside. Long, dragging movements through snow, scratch marks that would appear on his walls, impossible marks too high to be reached by any animal he could name. He never saw the Wendigo again, but he felt it, always at the edge of perception, a hunger that watched and waited and remembered. And he understood now what Joseph had meant. Some things you witness, some things you acknowledge, and then you carry that knowledge like a wound that never fully heals. The real horror wasn't the monster. It was knowing monsters were real, had always been real, would always be real, existing in the thin places between belief and denial, fed by the arrogance of certainty and the consequences of forgetting why ancient wisdom taught you to fear the dark. David Ramirez learned to live with that knowledge. He taught others the protocols, the protections, the old ways that science dismissed but experience validated. He became the person who understood that sometimes the most rational response to the irrational was respect. And every winter, when the snow fell early and the cold struck deep, he'd stand at the edge of the forest and whisper the words Joseph had taught him. Not prayers exactly, more like acknowledgments. Recognition that the boundaries were fragile, that hunger was patient, and that some transformations, once begun, could never be reversed. The trees listened, the darkness answered, and David learned to live in the space between what he knew was true and what he'd once believed was possible. That space, he discovered, was larger than anyone wanted to admit, and far more crowded than human arrogance could comprehend. The moss had teeth marks. Robert Fitzgerald knelt on the decomposing nurse log, his field lens focused on the impossibility before him. 15 years of botanical surveys, forest management, and environmental monitoring had taught him to catalog anomalies with detached precision. But this required a vocabulary he didn't possess. The Isothecium myoceroides, that ubiquitous feather moss coating every surface in the Hoh rainforest, showed clear evidence of mastication, not herbivore browsing, not insect damage, bite marks. Human-sized incisors had torn through the bryophyte layer, leaving saliva that his pH strip registered at 4.2, far more acidic than anything in mammalian baseline data. He photographed the evidence with his Nikon D90, the camera's timestamp reading 0947, October 23, 2009. 3 days since Jordan Hayes had missed her scheduled check-in, the wildlife researcher's last radio transmission had been brief, professional, unremarkable. Finalizing bat acoustics at research station, data looking good. Out. Nothing in her voice to suggest what Fitzgerald would find 72 hours later when he led the search team to her camp. The research station itself had been intact. Too intact. Jordan's tent stood perfectly erected, guy lines taut, rainfly secured with the obsessive precision he'd come to associate with field biologists. Her equipment remained meticulously organized. The Pedersen D240X bat detector, the Zoom H4n audio recorder, the Bushnell Trail cameras, all accounted for and functional. Her sleeping bag lay neatly rolled. Her dehydrated meals were stacked in descending caloric order. Even her field journal rested on the collapsible table, pencil marking her place at an entry dated October 20th. But Jordan herself had vanished. What she'd left instead were patterns. Fitzgerald had noticed them immediately. The search team had not. His colleagues saw a missing person case, straightforward if unfortunate, the kind that happened when inexperienced researchers underestimated the Hoh's 96 miles of trails and infinite opportunities for disorientation. They'd organized grid searches, checked likely fall zones, contacted the Coast Guard for aerial support. Standard protocol, logical procedure. Fitzgerald saw geometry. 7 trees surrounding Jordan's camp bore fresh carvings. Symbols etched through bark into cambium with surgical precision. Not the crude vandalism of initials and hearts, but intricate glyphs that resembled neither English nor any native Quinault design he recognized. Each symbol measured exactly 17 centimeters in height. Each had been cut at precisely 143 centimeters from the ground. Heart height, he'd noted with discomfort. The trees formed a perfect heptagon, Jordan's tent at its center. He'd documented everything, of course. Photographed the symbols from multiple angles, measured distances with his Bushnell laser rangefinder, recorded GPS coordinates on his Garmin E-Trex. The data was clean, empirical, Undeniable. The interpretation was where his training failed him. The blood analysis had arrived that morning via email from the Clallam County lab. Jordan's sleeping bag had tested positive for type AB negative, rare, matching her medical records. Volume suggested significant blood loss. But the timestamp was wrong. The hemoglobin degradation patterns indicated the blood had been deposited approximately 96 hours before Jordan's final radio transmission, 4 days before she'd claimed to be alive and working. Fitzgerald had read the report 3 times, certain of a lab error. He'd called the technician, a woman named Sandra Chen, whose irritation at his skepticism came through clearly even over a satellite phone connection. "Mr. Fitzgerald, I ran the analysis twice. The blood is 4 days older than your timeline suggests. Either your timeline is wrong or..." She'd paused. "Or something else is wrong." Something else. That phrase had been echoing in his mind for 6 hours now, expanding to fill the spaces between rational thoughts. Something else accounted for the bite marks in the moss. Something else explained why Jordan's trail cameras had captured 1,047 images of empty forest, then a single frame at 03:33 on October 21st, showing Jordan standing motionless in front of her tent, eyes reflecting the infrared flash like a nocturnal predator's. Something else justified the fact that every bat within a 5-mile radius had abandoned their roosts, leaving the acoustic monitors silent, except for a low-frequency pulse that repeated every 1.7 seconds. Too slow for echolocation, too regular for environmental noise. Fitzgerald stood, his knees protesting the damp cold that permeated the temperate rainforest even in autumn. The Hoh River Trail stretched before him, the path to Jordan's research station cutting through Sitka spruce and western hemlock that had been growing since before Columbus. The canopy blocked most sunlight, creating a perpetual twilight that the rain intensified into something almost submarine. Rainfall here averaged 140 inches annually. Today felt like all of it was falling at once. His radio crackled. Actual static, not the clean digital silence of modern communication. "Fitzgerald, this is Base. The Hayes family just arrived at the ranger station. They're asking to speak with you. Over." Jordan's parents. Fitzgerald had been dreading this conversation since the search began. What could he tell them? "Your daughter disappeared after apparently dying 4 days before she vanished? We found symbolic carvings that match nothing in any database. The forest itself seems to be rejecting normal investigation." "Copy. Base, tell them I'm following up on evidence at the research site. Will return by 1500 hours. Over." "Understood. They're pretty insistent, Rob. The mother's asking about Jordan's last words. Says there's something we need to know about the family. Over." Fitzgerald felt something cold settle in his stomach. What kind of something? Over. Static. Then, "She says Jordan's grandmother was Romanian, from a village called Halmaju. Says there are stories." Over. The radio felt suddenly heavy in his hand. He'd done his research after finding the symbols, cross-referencing them through every database he could access via the station's satellite internet. Native American glyphs, occult symbology, even Celtic runes. Nothing matched. But he hadn't tried Romanian folk patterns because why would he? Jordan Hayes was American, born in Seattle, educated at the University of Washington. Her dissertation was on Myotis volans migration patterns, not Eastern European mythology. Except her grandmother was from Halmaju, a village in the Carpathian foothills, a region with its own catalog of impossibilities. "Tell them I'll be there in 90 minutes, Fitzgerald said, "and ask Mrs. Hayes what she knows about Strigoi." Over. The pause was longer this time. "Say again?" Over. "Strigoi. Strigoi. It's Romanian. Just ask her. Over and out." He clipped the radio to his belt and turned back to Jordan's camp. The symbols on the trees seemed more distinct now, though the light hadn't changed. His mind was filling in details it had previously dismissed as irrelevant. The way each glyph incorporated a specific number of lines, 7, always 7, the direction of the cuts, all made right to left, the trees themselves chosen not randomly but specifically, all western hemlock, all approximately the same age, all bearing old fire scars on their north-facing sides. Someone had planned this. Jordan? Or something wearing Jordan's appearance after October 19th when she'd actually died? Fitzgerald approached the nearest carved tree, pulling a latex glove from his pack. The cuts were clean, made with a sharp blade. He touched the exposed wood, expecting it to feel like any other wound in living tissue. Instead, the cambium was ice cold, far colder than ambient temperature could explain, and there was a smell. Faint, chemical, wrong. Not decay exactly, something else. That phrase again, something else. His field training had taught him to observe, document, and report. Interpretation was for specialists. But the specialists were 90 miles away in Port Angeles, and Jordan's parents were 90 minutes behind him with information about Strigoi, a word he'd encountered exactly once in an undergraduate folklore class he'd taken as an elective. The professor had been enthusiastic about Eastern European vampiric entities, describing them as different from the Dracula popularized by Stoker. Strigoi were real to the villages that believed in them. Not romantic figures, but parasitic dead, intelligent and malevolent, returning to drain the living while wearing familiar faces. The professor had mentioned something else too. Strigoi could be prevented through specific burial practices, or created through their violation. Fitzgerald walked the perimeter of the heptagon, studying the ground. Jordan's boot prints were everywhere, size 7 Vask hiking boots, the tread pattern as familiar to him now as his own. But there were others, prints that matched Jordan's exactly but pressed deeper into the soil, suggesting greater weight or a heavier footfall. He photographed one such impression, placing his field ruler beside it for scale. The depth was approximately twice that of Jordan's normal stride. Something wearing Jordan's boots, something heavier than Jordan's 127-pound frame according to her medical records. His Garmin beeped, the waypoint for Jordan's secondary monitoring site, a roosting cave she'd been studying 1.3 miles northeast of the main camp. She'd mentioned it in her journal, the final entry dated October 20th. Unusual activity at Cave Site B. Myotis not responding to typical pattern. Will investigate tomorrow with full acoustic array. Note, local air temperature drop of 11 degrees within 50 meters of entrance. Check equipment calibration. Fitzgerald hadn't visited the cave yet. The search team had prioritized the main camp and likely injury sites. But Jordan's journal entry nagged at him. Unusual activity. Temperature drop. And most importantly, the entry was dated the day after the blood evidence suggested she'd died. The trail to Cave Site B was unmarked, requiring navigation by GPS and topographic memory. Fitzgerald moved through the temperate rainforest with the automatic care of long practice, avoiding false trails created by elk paths, stepping over nurse logs thick with Oregon grape and salal. The rainfall intensified, turning the forest floor into a confusion of water and mud. His Gore-Tex jacket shed the worst of it, but water found its way into every gap, cold and insistent. The temperature dropped as he approached the cave, not the gradual cooling of increased elevation, but a sharp, localized decrease that his body registered before his instruments confirmed it. 11 degrees Celsius to -3 within a 20-meter span. His breath misted. The rain began to freeze mid-fall, creating a sound like wind chimes as ice crystals struck leaf litter. The cave entrance was a vertical crack in a basalt outcropping, narrow enough to require sideways entry. Jordan's field markers were visible, reflective tape at the entrance, a survey flag marking her equipment cache. Her Pedersen bat detector sat protected under a waterproof tarp, its digital display dead despite fresh batteries. Fitzgerald checked the unit. No physical damage. No obvious malfunction. Just a complete absence of function, as if something had drained the electrical potential from its circuits. He aimed his LED flashlight into the cave. The beam penetrated perhaps 15 feet before the darkness seemed to absorb the light entirely. Not the normal attenuation of illumination over distance, but an active negation, as if the darkness was a substance rather than an absence. Jordan? His voice sounded flat, dead, swallowed by acoustics that shouldn't exist in what his topographic maps indicated was a relatively small cavity. The darkness shifted. Fitzgerald's rational mind tried to classify the movement as a trick of light, a shadow cast by his own motion. But there was no light to cast shadows. The darkness was moving independently, coalescing into a shape that was almost but not quite human. Almost Jordan's height. Almost her build. Almost. "Robert." The voice came from inside the cave, and it was Jordan's voice, identical to her last radio transmission, flat and professional and utterly wrong because Jordan Hayes was dead and had been dead for 6 days. Every survival instinct Fitzgerald had acquired through 15 years of wilderness work screamed at him to run. His training insisted on documentation. He raised his camera, finger finding the shutter button through muscle memory. The flash fired once, illuminating the cave interior for a fractured second. Jordan stood 20 feet back in the cavity. She wore the same clothing as in her last trail camera photo: gray fleece jacket, dark hiking pants, the University of Washington ball cap she favored. But her posture was wrong, spine too straight, head tilted at an angle that suggested either a broken neck or something that had learned human stance from observation rather than instinct. Her eyes reflected the flash, not the red of normal human eyeshine, but a pale blue-white, luminescent and hungry. The thing wearing Jordan's shape smiled. Its teeth were wrong, too many of them, arranged in rows that suggested shark ancestry more than mammalian evolution. Fitzgerald ran. The forest that had been familiar transformed into an obstacle course of roots and deadfall and sudden drops. His rational mind noted details even in panic. The temperature returning to normal within 30 meters of the cave, the complete absence of wildlife sounds, the way his breath came in gasps that tasted like ozone and copper. Behind him, something moved through the underbrush with fluid grace, not crashing or breaking branches, but flowing between obstacles with liquid precision. He keyed his radio without breaking stride. "Base, this is Fitzgerald. I have a situation at Cave Site B. Request immediate backup and..." Static. Not the normal white noise of poor reception, but something rhythmic, pulsing at that same 1.7-second interval Jordan's acoustic monitors had recorded. "Base, do you copy? Over." The static resolved into breathing. Human breathing. Jordan's breathing, he realized, recognizing the slight wheeze of her documented asthma. "Robert." Her voice came through the radio now, intimate and terrible. "Why are you running? I'm still here. I'm still collecting data. The bats are fascinating, Robert. They know things. They know how to find the threshold between living and not. They've been teaching me." Fitzgerald threw the radio into the underbrush and kept running. The Hoh River Trail was ahead. He recognized a massive Sitka spruce with a fire scar that resembled a screaming face. The main trail meant other hikers potentially, or at minimum a clear path back to the ranger station. His legs burned. His lungs ached. His scientific training, that carefully cultivated objectivity, was fragmenting into something raw and primal. The trail appeared through the trees, and with it, another hiker, a young man in a bright yellow rain jacket, consulting a soggy map. The man looked up at Fitzgerald's approach, concern crossing his features. "Hey, are you okay? You look..." "Run." Fitzgerald grabbed the man's shoulder. "Get back to the trailhead. Now." "What? Is there a..." The temperature dropped. That same impossible plunge from autumn chill to deep winter in seconds. The rain began to freeze, coating the trail in a sudden glaze of ice. And Jordan emerged from the tree line, moving with that wrong, too fluid grace. Her smile widened when she saw the other hiker. "Hello." Her voice was pleasant, conversational. "Beautiful day for a hike." The young man stared. "Jordan? Jordan Hayes? Oh my God, everyone's looking for you. Are you hurt? We need to..." "I'm perfect," Jordan said, and lunged. What happened next violated several laws of physics and most principles of biology. Jordan's jaw distended, unhinging like a snake's to reveal those rows of teeth, and she fastened onto the hiker's throat with surgical precision. The young man had time for one truncated scream before Jordan's throat began to work. pulling blood from his carotid artery with a suction that Fitzgerald could hear from 10 feet away. A wet, rhythmic sound that matched that damned 1.7-second pulse. Fitzgerald's camera was still in his hand. Some documentary instinct made him raise it, made him press the shutter. The flash froze the scene. Jordan feeding, the hiker's eyes already glazing, and something else. A shadow behind Jordan that dwarfed them both, massive and ancient and aware. Jordan's head snapped toward the flash, her eyes still luminous, fixed on Fitzgerald with predatory focus. Blood stained her mouth, too much blood, pooling on the ground in quantities impossible from a single human body. "Your turn, Robert," she said, and her voice had layers now, harmonics that suggested multiple speakers. "I've learned so much. The grandmother's stories were true. All of them. Do you want to know what happens when someone dies wrong? When the last breath is taken with rage and hunger and the absolute certainty that death is not the end?" She released the hiker's body. It crumpled, already assuming the waxy pallor of significant blood loss. Jordan stepped over it, her movements becoming more fluid, less constrained by skeletal limitations. "Jordan died on October 19th, Fitzgerald said, his voice surprisingly steady. "You're not her. I'm more than her." The thing smiled, and Fitzgerald saw Jordan's memories in its expression, her personality trapped inside something that wore her flesh like clothing. "I'm what the grandmother feared, what her village burned and beheaded and buried at crossroads. Strigoi. We don't just take blood, Robert. We take everything. Every memory, every skill, every relationship. Jordan's knowledge is mine now. Her research, her passion for bats, those beautiful little creatures that exist between worlds, neither fully of day or night. She understood thresholds, and now I do too." Fitzgerald backed away, his mind racing through fragmentary memories of that undergraduate folklore class. Strigoi could be stopped. There were methods, traditional, specific, culturally embedded. But what were they? Beheading, yes. Burial at crossroads. Staking through the heart with, what? Ashwood? Hawthorne? He couldn't remember. "The cave," he said. "That's where Jordan died." The Strigoi nodded, pleased. "She fell. A simple accident, really. 20 feet onto basalt. The skull fracture was catastrophic. But she was so angry, Robert. So full of unfulfilled potential. Graduate school unfinished. Data uncollected. A lifetime of discovery cut short by a moment's inattention on wet rock. That anger was enough. That rage at interruption. The grandmother's blood made it stronger. Bloodlines matter, you see. The villages knew. They always knew." Behind the Strigoi, the dead hiker twitched. Fitzgerald's scientific objectivity shattered completely. He turned and sprinted, abandoning the trail for rough forest, crashing through salal and huckleberry, his only thought to put distance between himself and the impossible. His GPS was useless now. The coordinates kept jumping, placing him miles from his actual location, then kilometers out in the Pacific, then impossibly inside the Earth itself. His compass spun freely, unable to find magnetic north. Even his wristwatch was failing, the digital display flickering through dates. October 23rd, October 19th, October 31st. Dates that hadn't happened yet or couldn't happen again. He burst into a clearing he didn't recognize, unusual in a forest he'd mapped for 15 years. A small structure stood at its center, barely more than a shack, constructed from rough-cut cedar that looked simultaneously ancient and new. Smoke rose from a chimney pipe. Fitzgerald had no other options. He stumbled to the door and pounded. It opened immediately. The woman who answered was elderly, perhaps 80, with the weathered face of someone who'd spent decades outdoors. She took one look at Fitzgerald's expression and stepped aside. Inside, quickly. The shack's interior was a single room lined with bundles of dried herbs, glass jars containing substances Fitzgerald couldn't identify, and religious iconography that mixed Catholic saints with symbols he'd seen carved on trees around Jordan's camp. A fire burned in a small stove, too hot for the fuel it consumed. "You've seen it," the woman said. It wasn't a question. Jordan Hayes. It's Strigoi. The woman moved to a shelf, selecting items with practiced efficiency. The Hayes girl. I heard she went missing. I knew it was too late when they found her camp empty. 3 days dead before anyone looks? That's enough time. More than enough. You know about this? Fitzgerald's hands were shaking. About Strigoi? I'm Anka Petrescu. My family's from Hulmaju, same as the Hayes grandmother. We left in 1952, but the old knowledge came with us. Had to. Some things don't respect borders. She was assembling a bundle now. Dried plants, a small bottle of clear liquid, and a wooden stake that looked hand-carved. The grandmother married American, thought the ocean would protect her bloodline. But the blood remembers. Always remembers. Jordan's parents are at the ranger station, Fitzgerald said. They mentioned the grandmother's stories. Too late for stories, time for action. Anka thrust the bundle at him. The stake is ash wood, blessed by a priest who understood the old ways. The bottle contains water from the Hulmaju church well. I had it sent years ago when I heard the Hayes girl was living in the forest. The herbs are oosteroi and moricini, garlic and blackthorn. You need all three. I can't. Fitzgerald stared at the items. This is insane. You photographed it, yes? Anka's eyes were sharp. The camera you carry, you have evidence? He did. Multiple images on the Nikon's memory card. Jordan's impossible eyeshine, the feeding, the shadow behind her that suggested something even larger than the Strigoi itself. The photographs won't convince anyone, Anka said. Digital images can be manipulated. Bodies, though. Bodies tell the truth. You need to find where Jordan Hayes died. The real body, not the thing walking around wearing her face. Strigoi returned to their corpse to rest. That's when they're vulnerable. The cave, Fitzgerald said. Cave Site B. That's where it happened. Then that's where you must go, before it creates another. The hiker it fed on, did you see him fall? Fitzgerald nodded, sick. He'll rise at sunset, and he'll be hungry, and he'll create another, and another. The progression is geometric, Mr. Fitzgerald. 1 becomes 2, becomes 4, becomes 8. In a week, the entire Ho Valley will be crawling with them. In a month, they'll reach Seattle. The scientific part of Fitzgerald's mind wanted to reject this. Vampiric entities couldn't exist. They violated thermodynamics, conservation of mass, basic biology. But the same scientific training that insisted on materialism also demanded he accept evidence. And the evidence was crawling around the forest wearing Jordan Hayes' face. Sunset is in 3 hours, he said. Then you have 3 hours. Anka pressed the bundle into his hands. Find the corpse. Stake it through the heart. It must be through the heart, and the stake must be driven in a single blow. Then cut off the head and bury both pieces separately. Head facing east, body facing west. Pour the blessed water over both. Burn the herbs on top. This breaks the Strigoi's hold. And the one already walking around? Anka's expression darkened. Once severed from its corpse, it will weaken. You'll have a chance. But only a chance. Strigoi are fast, strong, and they know everything their host knew. Jordan Hayes knew this forest, yes? Better than almost anyone. Then it will use that. It will lead you in circles, tire you out, wait for night when it's strongest. You must be smart, Mr. Fitzgerald. Smarter than a dead graduate student with supernatural power and 15 years of your colleagues' experience to draw on. Fitzgerald looked at the stake in his hands. Ash wood, Anka had said. Blessed. The tool felt solid, real. A piece of rational universe in a day that had abandoned rationality entirely. He thought of Jordan's parents, waiting at the ranger station for news. He thought of the dead hiker, soon to be another vector of infection. He thought of Seattle, of the geometric progression Anka described, of Strigoi spreading through a population that didn't believe in them and wouldn't know how to fight back. I need rope, he said, and a shovel, do you have a machete? Anka smiled, a fierce expression that suggested she'd been waiting for exactly this question. She opened a chest in the corner and began pulling out tools that looked both practical and ceremonial. My husband was a logger before the arthritis took his hands, she said. I kept his equipment just in case. The old people always said, hope for the best, but keep an axe sharp. 20 minutes later, Fitzgerald left the shack equipped like some nightmarish hybrid of park ranger and vampire hunter. The stake was secured to his belt. The blessed water sloshed in a Nalgene bottle in his pack. The herbs were wrapped in waxed paper in his jacket pocket. And he carried a machete that Anka's husband had apparently kept razor sharp, its edge gleaming in the dim forest light. The temperature dropped as he approached Cave Site B for the second time. His breath misted. The rain had turned to sleet. The forest felt empty in a way that transcended mere absence of wildlife. It felt evacuated, as if every living thing with survival instincts had fled. The cave entrance loomed, that vertical crack in basalt that had become a gateway to something older than Olympic National Park's establishment in 1938. Older than the Kino people's first settlements. Old as human fear of death and what might come after. Fitzgerald clicked on his LED flashlight and squeezed through the opening. The interior was larger than expected, the narrow entrance opening into a chamber approximately 30 feet across. His light found Jordan immediately. The real Jordan, not the thing wearing her face. Her body lay where she'd fallen 6 days ago, neck bent at an angle that confirmed Anka's description of a catastrophic skull fracture. She'd been trying to document something, Fitzgerald realized. Her camera lay beside her, its lens shattered. Her field journal was open, the last entry visible. Cave Site B contains markings consistent with... The writing ended mid-sentence, interrupted by sudden death. But Jordan's corpse had been altered. Someone, something, had arranged her carefully, positioning her limbs in a specific pattern that mirrored the heptagon of marked trees at her main camp. 7 small cuts marked her exposed skin, forehead, throat, sternum, both palms, both feet. The cuts still seeped, suggesting active circulation impossible in a 6-day-old corpse. And there were symbols carved into the cave floor around her body, the same glyphs from the trees but arranged in a pattern that suggested a circuit diagram or ritual boundary. Fitzgerald photographed everything, that documentary instinct still functioning even as his hands shook. Then he approached the corpse, stake and machete ready. "I'm sorry, Jordan," he said to the dead woman who couldn't hear. "You deserved better than this." He positioned the stake over her heart, or where her heart should be given the body's positioning. The ash wood felt warm in his hands despite the cave's cold. He raised the machete, preparing to drive the stake through in a single blow as Anka had instructed. "Stop." Jordan stood at the cave entrance, the animated Jordan, the strigoi wearing her flesh. She'd removed her jacket despite the freezing temperature, revealing arms covered in symbols that matched those carved into the cave floor. Her eyes were luminous in the darkness. "That's mine," she said, gesturing at the corpse. "You can't have it. I need it." "You're dead," Fitzgerald said. "The real Jordan Hayes died 6 days ago. Death is just a transition." The strigoi moved into the cave, its movements wrong in ways Fitzgerald's mind couldn't fully process. Jordan understood that. She spent her life studying bats, creatures of twilight existing in the space between. She was ready for this even if she didn't know it. Her grandmother's stories prepared her bloodline. Her grandmother's stories were warnings. The strigoi laughed, and the sound echoed with those strange harmonics. "Oh, Robert, you're so binary. Warning, promise. The old people understood these things aren't opposites. They're the same truth viewed from different angles. Yes, strigoi are dangerous, but they're also powerful. They're also free of the limitations that make human life so desperately short." Jordan was going to die eventually. Car accident, cancer, age. This way, she continues. Forever. "This isn't continuation," Fitzgerald said. "It's parasitism. Call it what you want. It's still existence. And existence is better than the alternative." The strigoi was closer now, 15 feet away, its smile revealing those rows of teeth. "You could join us, Robert. 15 years of wilderness expertise. Imagine what you could accomplish without the burden of mortality. You could study this forest for centuries, watch it change, adapt, evolve, become part of its history instead of just its chronicler. The offer was tempting in a way Fitzgerald hadn't expected. He thought of his ex-wife, remarried now with children he rarely saw. His mother, dead from Alzheimer's 3 years ago. His career, solid but unremarkable, facing mandatory retirement in 15 years. The Strigoi was right. Human life was desperately short, bounded by time and biology in ways that felt arbitrary and cruel. But Jordan's corpse lay at his feet, neck broken, 6 days rotting, and the thing offering him eternity had created that corpse, had drunk that hiker dry, would spread through the population like disease if not stopped. No, Fitzgerald said, and drove the stake through Jordan's heart. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The Strigoi shrieked, a sound that belonged to no human throat, and collapsed as if its strings had been cut. The symbols carved into the cave floor began to glow with pale light. Jordan's corpse convulsed once, then went still in a way that suggested true death, final death, the kind that didn't leave space for resurrection or continuation. But the Strigoi wasn't finished. It crawled toward its corpse, trailing that blue-white luminescence, its movements desperate and wrong. Fitzgerald grabbed the machete, his hands slippery with sweat despite the cold, and brought the blade down on the animated Strigoi's neck. The head separated with less resistance than expected, as if the thing's cohesion had been primarily supernatural rather than physical. The body collapsed, dissolving into a viscous substance that smelled like copper and ozone. The head rolled, its eyes still luminous, its mouth still working. The grandmother knew, it whispered. She warned them all. But blood calls to blood, Robert. There are others, descendants, bloodlines. The old countries sent their children to America, but they sent their curses too. Then the light faded from its eyes and Jordan Hayes was truly dead. Fitzgerald worked quickly, aware that sunset was approaching. He separated Jordan's corpse's head as Anka had instructed, trying not to think about the fact that he was desecrating the body of a colleague, a researcher who dedicated her life to understanding the natural world. He buried the pieces separately, facing east and west. He poured the blessed water over both. He burned the herbs, their smoke sharp and purifying in the cave's stale air. When he emerged, the forest felt different, not normal. That would take time if it ever happened, but less oppressively hostile. The temperature was rising. Sleet turned back to rain. And in the distance, he could hear the first tentative calls of evening birds returning to roost. His radio crackled, normal static this time, free of those rhythmic pulses. Fitzgerald, this is base. Do you copy? Over. He keyed the transmit button. This is Fitzgerald. I copy. Over. Rob, we've got a situation. The hiker who was with you, yellow jacket, early 20s, his friends just reported him missing. Last seen on the Hoh River Trail about 2 hours ago. Can you... Fitzgerald looked at his watch. Sunset in 45 minutes. The hiker had been dead for 3 hours, fed on by a Strigoi, left in the forest to transform as darkness fell. If he rose as one of them, the cycle would begin again. I know where he is, Fitzgerald said. Send the full SAR team to my coordinates, and tell them to bring every light source they have. We need to find him before dark. Copy that. Rob, the Hayes family is still asking about Jordan. Do we have any? We found her, Fitzgerald interrupted. In cave site B, accident, fatal. I'll have a full report when I return. The partial truth felt like cowardice, but what else could he say? We found her corpse being used as an anchor by a Romanian vampiric entity that fed on a hiker and will create more of its kind unless we dig up a body and desecrate it before sunset. His career would end. His testimony would be dismissed, and the Strigoi would continue spreading because no one would believe. Unless he showed them the photographs. Fitzgerald looked at his camera, its memory card containing images that violated natural law. Evidence of the impossible. Documentation of nightmare. He thought of Anka's words. Digital images can be manipulated. No one would believe. But they might investigate. They might take precautions. They might, at minimum, ensure the bodies were treated correctly, buried facing the right directions, beheaded if necessary, buried at crossroads as the old traditions demanded. Base, when the SAR team arrives, I need them to bring additional equipment, specifically medical examiner protocols for multiple casualties, and tell them we'll need to contact the Quino Nation. I think we've stumbled onto something with cultural significance. Their input will be critical. A pause. Multiple casualties? Rob, how bad is it out there? Fitzgerald looked at the darkening forest, at the shadows pooling between trees, at the caves and crevices and hidden places where the old world still held sway despite centuries of rationalist certainty. It's complicated, he said. I'll explain everything when you get here, just hurry. We're losing daylight. He spent the remaining 40 minutes searching for the dead hiker, following the trail of disturbed vegetation back toward where he'd last seen the body. He found it in a drainage ditch, already showing signs of the transformation. The skin taking on that waxy pallor, the lips pulling back from teeth that were beginning to change their configuration. Fitzgerald had the stake. He had the machete. He had Anka's blessed water and her herbs. And he had 30 minutes until sunset. He got to work. By the time the SAR team arrived, their LED searchlights turning the forest twilight into harsh noon, Fitzgerald had secured 2 corpses and prevented 2 resurrections. He'd also formulated a story that combined enough truth with strategic omissions to be believable. Jordan had fallen in the cave, suffering fatal injuries. The hiker had apparently discovered her body and sustained injuries of his own. Animal attack, Fitzgerald suggested, noting the throat wounds with careful precision. Both deaths were tragic accidents, the kind that happened when people underestimated wilderness hazards. The SAR team accepted the explanation because the alternative was unthinkable. Bodies were recovered, reports were filed, Jordan's parents were notified. The case was officially closed within a week, ruled misadventure due to unsafe cave exploration and subsequent predator scavenging. Only Fitzgerald and Anka Petrescu knew otherwise. He visited her shack 3 days later, returning her equipment and seeking answers. She served him strong coffee and listened to his full account without interruption. You did well, she said finally. The Hayes girl is at rest, the hiker too. The infection is contained. For now, Fitzgerald said. But you mentioned other bloodlines, other descendants. Anka nodded slowly. The villages sent many children to America. Not all of them knew what they carried. Not all of them died correctly when their time came. The old curses persist because the old angers persist. Resentment at interrupted life, rage at unfulfilled potential. These emotions are universal, Mr. Fitzgerald, and certain bloodlines amplify them. So this could happen again. It will happen again, somewhere, sometime, but perhaps less frequently if people like you are prepared. She handed him a small notebook, its pages covered in dense handwriting. My mother's recipes, not for cooking, for the other things. Protection, prevention, how to recognize the signs, what to do when science fails and the old knowledge becomes necessary. Fitzgerald took the notebook, its leather cover worn smooth by generations of handling. I'm a park ranger. I deal with lost hikers and forest fires, not... You deal with wilderness, Anka interrupted. And wilderness is older than rationality, older than science. The forests remember things that civilization has forgotten. Sometimes those memories wake up. When they do, you'll need more than GPS and LED flashlights. He couldn't argue with that. His camera held proof, images he'd backed up to multiple drives, encrypted and secured, evidence that reality was more complicated than his training had suggested. He'd shown the photographs to no one, but he kept them, just in case. The grandmother, Fitzgerald said. Jordan's grandmother. Did she know what she was passing down? Of course she knew. Why do you think the family left Romania? The old people understood. You can't outrun blood, but you can prepare, you can warn, you can hope your descendants are smart enough to listen. Anka's expression softened. The Hayes girl didn't deserve what happened, but her grandmother tried. Sometimes trying is all we get. Fitzgerald left with the notebook and a burden of knowledge he hadn't wanted. He returned to his duties: trail maintenance, visitor education, wildlife monitoring. But the forest felt different now. He noticed things he'd previously dismissed. The places animals avoided without reason. The trees that grew in patterns suggesting intelligence rather than chance. The caves that stayed cold even in summer heat. And he kept Anka's equipment. The ashwood stake. The blessed water, periodically refreshed with shipments from that Romanian church well. The herbs, replaced annually as they lost potency. Tools he hoped never to use again but kept ready because hope wasn't a survival strategy. Jordan Hayes' official cause of death remained accidental trauma from a fall. Her research was posthumously completed by colleagues who noted her meticulous data collection and promising preliminary findings. Her name was added to the memorial at Olympic National Park headquarters, joining other researchers and rangers who died in service of wilderness preservation. Only Fitzgerald knew she'd died twice, once from a fall on October 19, 2009, and again, 3 days later, when he'd driven an ashwood stake through her heart and separated her head from her body and buried both pieces facing opposite directions while burning herbs older than America. He never told her parents. What would be the point? Their daughter was dead. How she died, the specifics, the horror, the impossible resurrection and necessary desecration would bring no comfort. Better to let them remember Jordan as she'd been, passionate, intelligent, dedicated to understanding the natural world. Though sometimes, on rounds through the Hoh rainforest, Fitzgerald paused at Cave Site B. The entrance had been officially closed, marked with warning signs and steel grating to prevent access, but he maintained a private trail to it, checking periodically for signs of disturbance. The symbols he'd found carved into the cave floor were still there, faded but visible. He photographed them regularly, documenting any changes. So far, the cave remained quiet. The dead stayed dead. The forest continued its cycles of growth and decay according to natural law. But Fitzgerald kept the stake sharp and the water blessed, and Anka's notebook close, because bloodlines were long and anger was patient and the old world's curses had deep roots. And because sometimes, on nights when the rain fell hard and the temperature dropped without reason, he thought he heard Jordan's voice on the wind. Not the Strigoi harmonics, but the real Jordan, the researcher who'd loved bats and threshold spaces, whispering a warning that death wasn't always the end, and some hungers persisted beyond the grave. On those nights, he checked his equipment and reviewed Anka's instructions and reminded himself that rationality was a tool, not a religion. Science explained most things, but for the rest, for the moments when the natural laws bent and broke and something else emerged from the gaps, the old knowledge still worked. If you were prepared, if you believed, if you were willing to drive a stake through a colleague's heart and live with that memory forever. Robert Fitzgerald had done those things. He'd carry them for the rest of his life, and when his time came, he'd make sure his own burial followed the old protocols: head facing east, body facing west, blessed water and protective herbs, just in case. Because he'd learned what Jordan had learned too late. Some transformations were permanent, and death was just the beginning of certain kinds of hunger. The moss still had teeth marks. He never documented them officially, but he photographed them annually, watching as they slowly faded. The bryophyte layer regenerating over the evidence of impossible mastication. Nature healing itself, covering scars, restoring normalcy. Until the next time. Because there would be a next time. Anka had been certain of that. The bloodlines persisted, the old angers waited, and the wilderness remembered everything. Robert Fitzgerald would be ready. David Ramirez had learned to trust his hands before his eyes. 20 years in these woods taught you that darkness could lie, but cold never did. The temperature dropping 40 degrees in 40 feet shouldn't have been possible. He stopped on the trail, his breath forming clouds that fell instead of rising. His Motorola radio crackled against his hip, but he ignored it. The thermometer clipped to his pack read 28 degrees. He removed his glove, pressing his palm against the air ahead. The cold bit deeper than November in northern Minnesota had any right to. Frost formed on his knuckles in seconds. 40 feet ahead, where the trail curved around a stand of white pine, something had changed the rules. David had spent 2 decades as a ranger in the Boundary Waters Canoe Area wilderness. He knew every temperamental quirk of this place, how sound carried differently over frozen lakes, how wind patterns shifted around granite outcroppings, how animal behavior changed with barometric pressure. He'd guided search and rescue operations in blizzards, extracted hypothermia victims from ice flows, tracked lost hikers through terrain that wanted them gone. He'd also learned, 3 years ago, that some people who went missing in these woods were never meant to be found. The memory surfaced like a body through thin ice. Marcus Chen, his trainee, 23 years old, confident to the point of recklessness. They'd been tracking a lost scout troop when Marcus had wandered off trail. David had found his radio first, then his jacket, then his boots, each item separated by exactly 1.2 miles, arranged in a perfect line pointing north. They'd searched for 6 weeks. The official report called it exposure and disorientation. David had stopped sleeping well, what they'd never put in the report. Marcus's equipment was laid out like offerings. Someone or something had arranged them with purpose. The radio squawked again. David thumbed it on. "Ramirez, go." "David, it's Sarah at Ely Station. Just got a ping on that spot beacon you flagged. Jordan Hayes' device activated 3 hours ago, Sector 7, near the Disappointment Lake Portage." David's chest tightened. Jordan Hayes had been missing for 4 days. His emergency beacon activating now after 96 hours of silence in sub-freezing temperatures wasn't good news. It was a signal maybe, but not the kind anyone wanted to find. "I'm 20 minutes from that sector," David said. "Weather?" "Front moving in. You've got maybe 4 hours of good light, then it's going to dump 8 inches on you." "Copy that." "David?" Sarah's voice carried something he didn't like. Hesitation. "Jordan's brother. That was Kevin Hayes, right? Your trainee 2 years back?" 3 years. David's jaw clenched. Kevin was Marcus Chen's friend. They'd trained together. The silence on the other end said everything. The Boundary Waters had a way of circling back on itself. "Be careful," Sarah finally said. David clicked off without responding. Careful was for people who still believed they had control. He moved forward into the cold. The temperature normalized within 20 steps, rising back to something November could explain. But David's hand still ached, bones feeling brittle in a way that had nothing to do with weather. He'd felt this before, the sensation of being studied by something that knew how to be patient. The trail to Disappointment Lake was a 2-mile portage through dense forest, marked by orange blazes on trees that had witnessed a century of footsteps. This time of year, most of the canoe routes were inaccessible, locked behind ice that wouldn't be solid enough to cross until January. Only hikers came this deep in late November, and only the stupid or desperate ones. Jordan Hayes had been both. The 24-year-old had registered for a solo camping permit despite warnings about early season storms. His vehicle sat at the Moose Lake entry point, a rusted Subaru with a bumper sticker that read, "Not all who wander are lost." David had checked the car himself on day 2 of the search. In the back seat, philosophy textbooks, a journal filled with drawings of trees, a dog-eared copy of Thoreau's Walden, no food wrappers, no trash, everything meticulously organized like Jordan was preparing for a ritual, not a camping trip. The journal had made David's stomach turn. The drawings weren't artistic, they were obsessive. The same tree, rendered from different angles, hundreds of times. Each sketch more detailed than the last, until the final pages showed something that didn't look like bark anymore. It looked like symbols, like language. David had shown it to Sarah. She'd suggested Jordan was just an art student working on a project. David hadn't mentioned that the tree in the drawings matched the white pine where they'd found Marcus Chen's radio. The forest changed as he moved deeper. The birches gave way to older growth, white pines and Norway pines that predated European contact. The Ojibwe had names for these trees, names that meant the standing dead, and those who watch. David had learned some of the language from a tribal liaison years ago, back when he'd thought understanding the history of a place could protect you from it. He'd been wrong. The spot beacon's coordinates led him off the main trail, into an area marked on his GPS as unimproved wilderness. No maintained paths, no campsites, no ranger stations. Just 150,000 acres of lakes, bogs, and forest that had swallowed more than a few overconfident hikers. The GPS showed his location as a blinking blue dot surrounded by vast emptiness. In 2009, these devices were still relatively new to the Park Service, and the signal was inconsistent at best. David trusted his compass more. He found the first marker a mile in. A backpack hung from a tree branch 10 feet off the ground. Not thrown there, placed. The branch was bent in a way that suggested weight had been applied carefully, deliberately. Jordan's name was stitched on the pack's side panel. David photographed it with his digital camera, each click of the shutter feeling too loud. He wouldn't touch it yet. Search and rescue protocol demanded he document everything before disturbing a scene. But protocol hadn't been written for this. The pack swayed slightly, though there was no wind. David circled the tree, checking for climbing marks. Nothing. The bark was smooth, undisturbed. No boot scuffs, no rope burns. Whoever, or whatever, had hung the pack 12 feet up had done it without using the tree for leverage. His radio crackled. He jumped, hand instinctively going to the bear spray on his belt. Ramirez, this is Eli. Just got another ping. Spot beacon is moving. It's heading northwest toward you. Current speed? Jesus. David, it's moving at about 8 miles per hour. David's mouth went dry. 8 miles per hour through unimproved wilderness terrain, in snow, in freezing temperatures. That was impossible. Even a trained ranger couldn't maintain that pace off trail. Not unless they were running, or being carried. Copy, he managed. I'm tracking. He left the backpack hanging and moved toward the beacon's location. The forest grew denser, the canopy blocking what little afternoon light remained. His headlamp beam cut through shadows that seemed to move wrong, sliding away from the light instead of being dispelled by it. The second marker appeared after another half-mile. Jordan's tent, fully erected, stakes driven into the frozen ground with military precision. The tent fabric was pristine, no tears, no damage. The zipper was open, the entrance gaping like a mouth. David approached slowly. Jordan Hayes. His voice died in the air, absorbed by the forest in a way that defied acoustics. He knelt by the entrance, shining his light inside. Empty sleeping bag, camp stove unused, water bottles frozen solid, but arranged in the center of the tent floor was something that made David's training, his 2 decades of experience, his carefully maintained rationality. All of it crumbled. Bones, small ones, bird bones, he told himself. Rabbit bones, arranged in a pattern that his brain insisted was random even as his gut recognized it as intentional. They formed a spiral, each bone placed with the precision of someone working from a blueprint. And in the center of the spiral, Marcus Chen's ranger badge. David's hand shook as he reached for it. The badge was corroded, covered in something that looked like frost but felt wrong when his fingers brushed it. The metal was warm. In 28-degree weather, the metal was warm. He pulled back, bile rising in his throat. No, he whispered. No, no, no. Marcus had been dead for 3 years, lost to the wilderness, body never recovered. And now his badge was here, in a tent belonging to a missing person who happened to be Marcus's friend's brother. The coincidence was too precise. The universe didn't work this way, but something else did. David stood too quickly, his vision swimming. The tent seemed to breathe, fabric expanding and contracting like lungs. He backed away, his boot catching on something, Jordan's journal. Open to a page covered in handwriting that hadn't been there when David examined it 4 days ago. Fresh ink, the words still wet despite the cold. It's not hunger anymore. It's all of me. Every cell remembers wanting. Every thought ends in teeth. The old one told me this was evolution. This was becoming something that could never be empty again. David, if you're reading this, and it knows you will be, it's been waiting for you. It's been waiting since Marcus. Some hungers take years to satisfy. The handwriting was Jordan's. David recognized it from the permit registration, but the words were wrong. The cadence was wrong. It was like reading a script performed by an actor who'd learned the lines phonetically without understanding the language. His radio hissed static. Through the white noise, a voice. David. So cold. Help. Marcus's voice. David yanked the radio from his belt, finger hovering over the transmit button. Every instinct screamed to respond. But he'd been trained better than instinct. He knew that voice was impossible. He knew, David, please, I can see you. The forest had gone absolutely silent. No wind, no birds. Even the usual settling sounds of trees adjusting to temperature changes had stopped. The silence was so complete that David could hear his own heartbeat, could hear the blood rushing through his ears, could hear the joints in his fingers cracking as he squeezed the radio hard enough to hurt. He turned slowly, scanning the forest. Nothing moved. But between the trees just at the edge of his headlamp's range, he saw them. Handprints in the snow. Dozens of them. All pointing toward him. Not prints from someone crawling. Prints pointing at him. Fingers aimed like arrows. David ran. His training said never run from a predator. Never abandon a scene. Never let fear override protocol. But training was a luxury for situations that made sense. This wasn't a bear attack or a lost hiker, or even a hostile human. This was something that had learned how to use his grief against him, something that knew exactly which memories would paralyze him. He crashed through underbrush, the GPS forgotten, navigation reduced to pure flight response. Behind him, he heard footsteps. No, not footsteps. Something heavier, something that moved on more than two legs, branches breaking in patterns that suggested a body too large for the spaces between trees. The temperature plummeted again. David's breath crystallized instantly, his lungs aching with each inhalation. Frost formed on his eyelashes. His radio continued to hiss that impossible voice. David, wait. I found something. You have to see. He burst into a clearing and stopped. The frozen lake stretched before him, Disappointment Lake living up to its name. But the ice was wrong. It was perfectly smooth, like polished glass, except for the center where something massive had broken through. The hole was too regular, too circular. Around its perimeter, more symbols. The same ones from Jordan's journal carved into the ice with something sharp enough to cut through 6 inches of frozen water like it was paper. And standing at the hole's edge, a figure. Jordan Hayes, or what was left of him. The young man stood impossibly still, his back to David. He wore the same clothes from his permit photo, a red jacket, hiking boots, but they hung wrong on his frame, like they'd been draped over a mannequin that didn't quite match human proportions. His breath didn't mist in the cold. Jordan? David's voice cracked. The figure's head tilted, but not the way a human head tilts. It was too far, too smooth, like ball joint rotation. David Ramirez. The voice came from Jordan's mouth but originated somewhere deeper, somewhere behind the flesh. The old one has been patient. 3 winters since Marcus. 3 winters of hunger. Do you know what hunger becomes when it outlives the body that feels it? David's hand went to his bear spray. Useless against this, but holding something physical kept him grounded. Where's Jordan? The thing wearing Jordan's body turned. Its face was Jordan's face, but the eyes were black. Not just the pupils, the entire eye, like someone had filled the sockets with ink. When it smiled, there were too many teeth, arranged in rows that suggested something prehistoric. Jordan is here. Jordan is becoming. He sought the old one. He read the forbidden names in books white men shouldn't translate. Wendigo, Weedigo, Witico. So many words for hunger that never ends. He called and the old one answered. Just like Marcus called, just like you'll call. Marcus didn't. Marcus was delicious. The thing's smile widened. His fear was so ripe. 3 years fermented makes for exquisite despair. And now you've come to the place where he became food. Did you think this was chance? Did you think Jordan chose this location randomly? The old one plans its feasts carefully. David's mind raced. Wendigo. He'd heard the stories from Ojibwe rangers, dismissed them as cultural metaphor for greed and isolation. Algonquian legends warned of spirits that possessed those who resorted to cannibalism, transforming them into monsters with eternal hunger. But those were stories, cautionary tales. The thing in front of him was not a story. Marcus's friend Kevin, David said slowly, trying to process, trying to find logic in madness. He trained with me after Marcus disappeared. He killed himself a year later, drove his car into a tree. No. The Jordan thing stepped closer. Kevin was a gift. The old one fed on him slowly, through dreams, through whispers. His death was just the physical conclusion of consumption that began the day Marcus vanished. And Kevin told his brother so many stories before he died. Told him about the trees that watch, the symbols that called. Jordan came here to understand. Instead, he became understanding. The ice beneath David's feet cracked. He looked down. The symbols carved around the hole were glowing, faint blue light pulsing in rhythm with something beneath the water. Something massive. What are you? What your kind always feared existed in the spaces between stars. What your ancestors knew to respect before you forgot how to listen. The Ojibwe called us Wendigo. The Cree called us Windigo. Names are just sounds humans make while dying. But what we are is simple. The hunger that transcends flesh. The want that outlives death. You can't kill what was never alive. You can't escape what exists in every empty place inside you. David backed away. The thing followed, matching his steps with predatory patience. Marcus tasted of failure, of guilt, of the particular sweetness that comes from a man who blamed himself for everything. But you, David, it inhaled deeply, savoring. You've been marinating in that guilt for 3 years. You've been tenderizing yourself with nightmares. Every time you came back to these woods, you were basting yourself in your own fear. The old one appreciates a meal that prepares itself. I'm not... David's boot hit solid ground. He'd backed off the ice. I'm not afraid of you. The thing laughed. The sound was wrong. Layered, multiple voices overlapping, some human, and some decidedly not. Oh, David, you've been afraid since the moment you found Marcus's radio. You just didn't know what you were afraid of yet. But now you do. Now you understand that there are things in these woods older than your species' entire existence. Things that learn to wear human faces the way you learn to wear clothes. Things that feed on more than flesh. It gestured toward the hole in the ice. Marcus is down there. What's left of him? Would you like to see? Would you like to know what happens to the body when the spirit has been consumed completely? David's hand closed around his radio. Sarah, he said quietly into the device. Emergency beacon. My location. Send everything. The Jordan thing tilted its head again. They won't come in time. The storm is starting. And even if they did, what would they see? A ranger who went mad in the woods. A ranger who finally cracked under the pressure of losing too many people. They'd find you tomorrow, frozen, and they'd say the same thing they said about Marcus. Exposure. Disorientation. Tragedy. They'd never know you were eaten from the inside out. Snow began to fall. Big, heavy flakes that should have taken minutes to accumulate, but within seconds covered everything. The storm Sarah had warned about was here, and it was wrong. Too fast, too localized, swirling only around this clearing like the weather itself was part of the thing's design. David had one option. He'd known it since seeing the symbols, since finding Marcus's badge, since hearing that impossible voice on the radio. Fire. The Ojibwe stories said Wendigo feared fire, not because it could kill them. You couldn't kill hunger itself, but because fire was the opposite of their nature. Fire was transformation through consumption, but it was temporary, purifying. The Wendigo were eternal consumption with no transformation, only endless appetite. His hands shook as he pulled the emergency flare from his pack. The thing watched him, amused. "Fire?" It laughed. "Oh, David. That's for the stories. The sanitized versions your culture tells itself to feel safe, but the old one is not the stories. The old one is what the stories were trying to warn you about before your language could even properly describe the warning." David didn't answer. He struck the flare. Red light exploded across the clearing, harsh and chemical. The thing flinched, just slightly, just enough. David ran, not toward the forest, but along the lake's edge, the flare held high. Behind him, the Jordan thing screamed. The sound wasn't voice anymore. It was wind and breaking ice and something that might have been laughter if laughter could shred reality. The footsteps behind him were wrong. Too many feet, moving too fast. David didn't look back. Looking back was how it got you. Looking back was how it showed you things that made you stop running. He threw the flare behind him without turning. The moment it left his hand, he heard the thing stumble, heard it retreat. Not far, just enough. There, through the snow, barely visible, the ranger station. 2 miles north, emergency shelter, CB radio, supplies. If he could reach it, if he could barricade himself until the storm passed, until backup arrived. Something grabbed his ankle. David crashed into the snow, chin striking frozen ground hard enough to crack teeth. He flipped onto his back. The Jordan thing stood over him, but it wasn't bothering with the human shape anymore. What crouched above him was tall, impossibly tall, 8 feet with limbs too long and joints that bent wrong. Its skin was gray like freezer burn, stretched over bones that looked sharp enough to cut from the inside. The face was still Jordan's, but the skull behind it had warped, elongating into something canine and predatory. Its eyes were black pits that seemed to absorb light. "You can't reach the station," it said with Jordan's mouth. "You could never reach the station. You've been running in circles. The old one controls this space, these trees, this ice, this storm. It's all the old one's body, and you're already inside it." David looked around. The trees were different. These weren't the pines from before. These were older, twisted, their bark covered in the same symbols from Jordan's journal. The snow had stopped falling, but it was everywhere, piled high against trunks in patterns that suggested architecture, like someone had been building walls from winter itself. Marcus understood eventually, the thing said. He stopped running. He accepted. It was beautiful, really. The moment he realized there was no escape, his fear transformed into something sweeter. Resignation has its own flavor. Would you like to taste it? It leaned down, opening its mouth impossibly wide. Inside, David saw not a throat but a passage, a tunnel that seemed to extend forever, lined with teeth all the way down. And at the very bottom, something moved. Something that might have been a person once, before being digested so slowly that the process had become a form of immortality. David thought of Marcus, of Kevin, of Jordan, who'd come here seeking answers and found only hunger. He thought of Sarah back at the station, waiting for a check-in that wouldn't come. He thought of all the reports he'd filed over 20 years, all the missing persons he'd marked as lost to wilderness, never knowing that some of them had been fed to something that treated the forest like a larder. And he realized he was tired. Tired of the guilt, tired of the fear, tired of pretending he had control in a place that had never been his to control. The thing sensed his resignation. It smiled. There it is. That's the flavor. That's what the old one has been waiting for. Thank you, David. Thank you for aging yourself so perfectly. Its mouth descended toward David's face. David pulled the second flare from his belt, the backup he'd kept hidden, and jammed it directly into the thing's open throat. He struck it active inside the creature's mouth. The thing's scream could have shattered glass if there'd been any glass to shatter. It reared back, clawing at its own face, flames erupting from between its teeth. The flesh didn't burn like human flesh. It burned like old paper, like dried leaves, like something that had been desiccated by decades of cold. David scrambled backward. The thing stumbled, still screaming, its form flickering between Jordan's body, and that skeletal nightmare and something else. Something vast and ancient that his brain refused to process fully, showing him only glimpses. Fur matted with ice, antlers made of frozen bone, eyes like empty wells that led down into geological time. And then it stopped screaming. It looked at David, really looked at him with something that might have been respect if entities like this could feel respect. "Oh," it said quietly. "You still want to fight, even knowing you've already lost. Even knowing this forest will take you eventually. If not today, then some other day. You'll come back. They always come back. And the old one is so very patient." It smiled one last time, Jordan's smile, perfect and human, and utterly wrong. Then it stepped backward into the storm and disappeared. David lay in the snow, shaking. The flare had bought him minutes. That was all. The forest was still wrong, the trees still marked with symbols, the air still thick with presence. But he had minutes. He stood. His GPS was dead, screen cracked from the fall. His radio hissed static. But he had his compass, and he had direction, and he had the training that said you never stop moving until you reach safety. David walked. The forest tried to stop him. Branches reached for his face. Snow deepened with each step until he was wading through drifts that shouldn't have accumulated so quickly. The temperature dropped until his lungs felt like they were inhaling shards of glass. Every shadow looked like Marcus. Every sound was that voice calling his name. But David walked. He found the trail by accident, stumbling onto marked trees just as his legs were giving out. The station appeared through the trees like a mirage, solid and real and impossibly far from where it should have been according to his mental map. He'd walked 7 miles in the wrong direction, or the forest had moved. He wasn't sure anymore which was more likely. Sarah was there when he burst through the door. She took one look at his face and reached for the emergency supplies. "David, Jesus Christ, we've been trying to reach you for 3 hours. The GPS said you were going in circles. I was about to send a team." "Don't." His voice was raw. "Don't send anyone into that sector. Market restricted. Winter closures. Whatever you have to do, keep people out of there." "What happened? Did you find Jordan?" David closed his eyes. He could still see it, that thing wearing Jordan's face. Still hear Marcus's voice on the radio. Still feel the cold that came from something other than weather. "Jordan's dead," he said finally. "Exposure. Disorientation. He went off trail and the cold got him. I found evidence. We'll recover the body in spring." It was a lie. There would be no body to recover. Jordan was being consumed in ways that transcended flesh, dissolved into something that would fuel that ancient hunger for months or years or however long it took for a human soul to be completely digested. Sarah studied him for a long moment. She'd been a ranger for 15 years. She knew what the wilderness could do to people. She knew what it looked like when someone came back from the woods fundamentally changed. "Okay," she said quietly. "I'll file the report. You're off duty until the psych eval clears you. Standard protocol after a failed recovery." David nodded. He knew he'd pass the evaluation. He'd tell them what they wanted to hear. Stress, exhaustion, grief over losing another person to the wilderness. They'd clear him. They'd put him back on duty. And eventually, maybe months from now, maybe years, someone else would go missing in Sector 7. Some other hiker would read the wrong book, learn the wrong names, speak the wrong words in places where ancient things still listened. And David would have to go back. Because that was the job. Because someone had to be the one who knew what was really out there. Because the forest needed people who understood that some missing persons were never meant to be found. And some things were never meant to be fed. He looked out the window at the darkening forest. Snow fell steadily now, the storm natural again, violent in the way November storms were supposed to be violent. Somewhere out there, Jordan Hayes was becoming something else. Somewhere even deeper, Marcus Chen's remains were nourishment for hunger that had no ending. And somewhere in the oldest part of the forest, where even the Ojibwe had learned not to go, something waited with the patience of geological time. Waited for the next person who would come seeking answers. The next person who would walk into the woods thinking they understood what waited there. The old one was patient. The old one had learned over centuries that humans would always come. Driven by curiosity, by grief, by the need to conquer every space, to map every territory, to believe that nothing existed that couldn't be understood and controlled. David had learned different. He'd learned that there were spaces in the world, in the woods, in the cold, in the terrible dark, where humanity's understanding meant nothing, where ancient hungers still fed, where the forest itself was alive in ways that no naturalist would ever document. He'd learned, but he couldn't speak it. Who would believe him? Who would accept that their rational world still had room for old gods that wore human faces and fed on more than flesh? So he'd go back to work. He'd patrol the trails. He'd search for lost hikers and file his reports. And when the next person disappeared in Sector 7, because there would be a next person, he'd be the one they sent to investigate. Because someone had to know. Someone had to stand between the things that lived in the deep woods and the tourists who thought wilderness meant tall trees and scenic views. Someone had to be the one who understood that every map had edges, and beyond those edges, the old rules still applied. The Wendigo was real. The old one was patient. And David Ramirez would carry that knowledge into the forest every single day until the forest decided it was time to collect. He touched the spot where his radio should have been. He'd lost it in the snow. But he could still hear it sometimes in the quiet moments. Marcus's voice calling his name. Jordan's voice asking for help. And someday, not today, but someday, his own voice, carried on wind that smelled like freezer burn and starvation, calling the next ranger who would be foolish enough or brave enough or broken enough to answer. The woods took care of their own. They always had. And David had finally accepted that he was theirs now. Marked and claimed. Kept alive only so the forest would have someone who could guide the next offering to the proper altar. Outside, the storm intensified. Inside, David poured coffee with hands that would never stop shaking. And in the deepest part of the boundary waters, where no trail reached and no map showed, something that had been hungry for millennia settled back into patient waiting. It had fed well today. It could afford to be patient, it always could. Hope you felt genuine terror. If you appreciate authentic horror rooted in real folklore, consider following for more stories. Which moment scared you most? Share your theory about what happened.